Hello! In this video, you will learn basically everything there is to know about layouts in Godot. By the end of it, you will be able to recreate the Zelda-style menu. Besides that, this video will also cover the main UI of a Zelda game, how to integrate layouts in a 2D game, we will cover controller input, and how to work with themes, including animations. At the end of all of this, you will be able to create pretty much any kind of user interface in any style that you want. And if you want to boost your game dev skills even further, you should check out the sponsor of this video, Brilliant. There are loads of technical concepts like trigonometry and vector math that you need to be a good game developer. And Brilliant is really good at explaining them using interactive lessons. I really like that you can either start from scratch or jump straight into more advanced topics. Really often I need a refresher on a specific topic, and Brilliant is really good at covering them. All of the lessons are super well designed, and you can access them from your computer and from your phone, which makes it extremely convenient to use. They also offer lots more advanced courses on things like artificial intelligence and statistics. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, check out brilliant.org/clearcode, scan the QR code on the screen, or go to the first link in the description. You will also get a 20% discount on an annual subscription, and you help me make more of these videos. So thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. On the screen, you can see 3 nodes that don't do very much. They simply display a color. However, once I start resizing the window, these nodes stay relative to each other in terms of position and size. And understanding how this works is vital to any UI project in Godot. Fundamentally, when you're working with control nodes, you can place them in 2 ways. The first one is something that you have probably already seen, where you're working with a position and a size. If you have ever placed a sprite 2D, this is what you have done. Control nodes can be placed in the same way, and then they would act like any other node 2D. Which means we are placing them via an XY position, and these values are absolute, meaning they don't change depending on the screen size. This makes it really easy to integrate a layout node into a game project. For example, if you want to have speech bubbles in a game, this is how you would do it, something we are going to do later. Now, this isn't a system you're going to use very often, but I still want to cover it, so let's have a very quick look at how this works. For all of that, I already have a Godot project open. If you look in the bottom left, there you can see a whole bunch of project folders that contain, for example, a couple of graphics for characters and a world. Nothing too fancy. You can find the entire project in the link in the video description. For now though, to get started, I want to work inside of one basics, which is an entirely empty folder. In there, I want to create a new scene where the root node should be a user interface. So click on that, and then you can see something. We have a red outline around the scene, along with some green needly things. On top of that, if you look in the top, there you have 3 icons. These are going to make a lot of sense in just a bit. For now, I would say just ignore them. On top of that, finally what you can do, if you add a node to control, you can look at the control nodes, and in there you have all of the nodes that you would expect for a user interface. For example, in there we have a label, which lets you type some text. There we go. And if you click on that, once again, you have a red outline along with some green needles. Those you always get for any kind of layout node. And those are going to make sense in just a second. For now though, to keep things a bit more visual, I don't want to add a label. Instead, I want to add a color rectangle, which is simply a rectangle that displays a color. A very simple node. If I'm adding this one, we are getting a rectangle with a color, and this color you can change. Let's go with a reddish color. Something like that, and that works reasonably well. To position this node, you want to look at the inspector and then go to layout. In there, you're getting a couple of basic attributes, which don't matter at the moment. The one that you want to look at instead is called transform. In there, we have size, position, rotation, scale, and pivot offset. I think most of these make sense. For example, we can set a size of 200 by 100. Then let me zoom out a bit. Now we have a rectangle that's 200 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall. Then we can set a position to, let's say, 50 and 40. Then we're adding an offset from the top left to the origin point by these numbers, which means I can measure this point from here to here is 40 by 50 pixels. Rotation is rotation, where we are rotating around the top left point. Same with scale, we are scaling around the top left point at the moment. If you don't like a rotation or scaling around this point, you want to work with the pivot offset. This effectively is the origin point of this rectangle. If I set it to half the size, which means 150, then you can see this little red cross is now right in the middle of this rectangle. As a consequence, if I now rotate it, we are rotating around the center. The same with scale, now we are scaling around this center point. And that is pretty much all there is to know for this kind of transform property. It's not terribly complicated, and most of the time, we're not going to use it anyways, for the simple reason that these numbers are absolute, meaning they don't change depending on what the screen size does. Or in other words, if I move this node to the bottom right, somewhere here-ish, then I want to save the entire scene. Let's rename it first of all to basics UI. I now want to save the entire thing inside of one basics and basics UI.tscn. Click on save, and then we have a scene that we can run. Which means if I now run it, we have this rectangle in the bottom right, which is totally fine, but if I resize the window, I can make it disappear super easily. And if I expand the window, it can very easily not be in the bottom right of the window anymore. Effectively for this node, we have set a distance to the top left, and this number does not change ever, which is quite inconvenient if you want to have a node that's always in the bottom right of the window. As a consequence, this system we are not going to use very much. I want to rename the color rectangle to position node, and then we can start talking about the actual system that we are going to use. For that, we don't want to use positioning anymore. Instead, we want to use an anchor system, where we don't set an absolute number for the position and the size anymore. Instead, we define a distance to each side of the window, meaning we define how far away the node is from the left, the right, the top, and the bottom of the window. Really important, these numbers are relative. They are always between 0 and 1. The result is going to be, if the screen size changes, you also change the node size and the node position. For this anchor system, we have 4 major attributes that you have to be aware of. The first one is the custom minimum size. This one defines a minimum size that the node can never go below. Very often this is mandatory, but when you're getting started, it's not too important. Instead, the most important attribute is anchor points. This one gives you the actual distance to each side, and also the attribute you're going to work with the most. Besides that, you have anchor offsets, and this is simply an offset from the anchor points. If you want to add 20 pixels to the right of the anchors, this is how you would do it. Finally, we have the grow direction, which is telling the node in which way to grow if the minimum size is exceeded. For all of that, here we are back in the project, and to get started, I want to move this position node to the top left so it's not in the way. Besides that, I want to add another color rectangle, for which I want to change the color to, let's say, a greenish color. Something like that. It's not too important. That looks about right. Now, to use the layout system, you want to go to Layout, and in there, we have the layout mode, where we have used positions so far, and this I want to change to anchors. If you do that, you can set anchor presets, where we have a whole bunch of options, and those options you can also see in the top left. Those are the same except without the text. But those I don't want to use. Instead, I want to use a custom anchor preset. If you do that, you can see the 4 attributes I just talked about. We have a custom minimum size, anchor points, anchor offsets, and a grow direction. Now by default, we always have some values for the anchor offsets. Godot is trying to make any node by default a size of 40, which I don't want, so let's get rid of this. If you do that, we cannot see the rectangle anymore, and instead we get a red dot and 4 green needles. How can we work with that? And the most important attribute that you want to look at is anchor points. In there, you can define the distance to the left, top, right, and bottom of the parent, which in our case right now is the window, but it could also be another control node. So at the moment, these 4 values define the distance from the node to the window, or in other words, this blue rectangle. These are the sides that we are working with at the moment. Currently, all of these values are 0, so we are always in the top left position. However, to change this, I want to leave left and top at 0. But then the right should be 0.5 and the bottom should be 0.25. If we are doing that, we are getting a visible rectangle again. The distance to the left side is 0, which means the left side of the rectangle is right on the left side of the screen. Same with the top side. We are always on the top of the window. However, for the right side, this changes. This value is 0.5, which means if the entire window has a size of 1, we are going halfway, up to this point, 0.5. Really important, this number is relative. If the screen size changes, this number also changes. Or in other words, if I now run the scene again, I can resize the window, and the green rectangle will always cover exactly half of the width of the window. Which means we are now working with relative numbers. Same with the bottom side. The bottom of the window covers 1/4 or 0.25 of the entire height. In other words, if this is the height of the window with a total value of 1, we are currently at 1/4, 0.25. And once again, this number is relative. I can go up and down, and we are always covering 1/4 of the height of the window. Using that system, it's quite trivial to place this rectangle in the bottom right. I want the left side to be 0.8, the top can also be 0.8, and then the right and the bottom should both be 1. If I run the scene again, the green rectangle is always in the bottom right, no matter what I do. It will never go away from this point. And really quickly, just to place some numbers on it, for the left side, this point would be 0, and we are going on a distance of 0.8 units. We are here for the left side of the rectangle. For the top, once again, the height of the window is a unit size of 1, and we are going 0.8 units up to here. For the right side, we are going all the way to the right, and for the bottom, we are, well, at the bottom. Understanding these anchor points is the most important part of layouts in Godot, so definitely make sure to play around with these numbers. Besides that, we have anchor offsets. Those basically in pixels add an offset to these anchor points. For example, imagine you want this green rectangle to be some kind of player UI, where you also have a bit of an offset to the right and to the bottom. Let's say you want to get rid of this bit and of this bit. For that, you can use anchor offsets, where you set a distance to the left that can go in this way or in this way. Not something I want to do. I want to work with the right and the bottom side. So if I increase the right side, we're going to the right, and if I decrease it, we're going left. If I set this number to a -10, same with the bottom, -10, then we don't change the green needles. Those stay as they were before, But now we have a 10 pixel offset to them on the right and the bottom, which means if I now run the entire scene again, we have a bit of padding to the bottom right. And that, once again, stays exactly like it was before, no matter the screen dimension, which is quite nice. Finally, we have grow direction, although this isn't going to make sense at the moment. First of all, we have to go up a bit and then talk about custom minimum size. This custom minimum size defines a, custom minimum size. Effectively, if you're setting a number in here, then the rectangle can never go below that number. Let's try this for the Y part. If I set it to 40, we might exceed it, not quite, but if I set it to 200, then we are definitely exceeding it. Which means now, this rectangle has to be at least 200 pixels tall. And since by default the layout cannot account for that, we are growing below this point. Which isn't usually what you want, because this part is outside of the window. It would not be visible. And for that, you have the grow direction, where you set the horizontal and the vertical grow direction. At the moment, the vertical one is bottom, meaning we are adding stuff to the bottom. If I set this to the top, then we are growing to the top. And now, if I increase the custom minimum size, we make this thing taller. Or, we are growing to the top. I can also make this both. Then we are going up and down. If you're on the bottom right, you always want to have the top grow direction. That way you don't grow outside of the window. And really important now, our custom minimum size for the height is 210 pixels, and we can never go below this value. If I run the scene, I can make this thing smaller, and the node will never be smaller than 210 pixels on the y-axis. I guess that's a bit hard to see. Let's change this 210 to a clean 100. That way the minimum size by default is not met. But if I run the game again, I can go up, and at some point the node stops growing. So down here you can see the node gets larger and larger. But if I go up there, we're getting smaller and smaller, but stop at some point. Because now we have reached 100 pixels, and the node can never be smaller than that. We have the 4 major attributes that you have to be aware of. If you understand these 4, you understand the basics of layouts. So let's practice all of that with an exercise. I want you guys to recreate this layout with 3 rectangles that you have seen in the intro. There's a bit of detail for every single one of them. Try to recreate this as best as you can. Pause the video now and see how far you get. I want to get rid of the 2 nodes we have created so far. We don't need them anymore. Instead, I want to add a new color rectangle. Let's call this one the orange rectangle. That's this rectangle here. It should always be in the center and has a size of 100 pixels by 100 pixels, with the size not changing. Let's start by changing the color to orange. We want to have quite a bit of red and just a bit of green, something like that. Now we have a color, and now I want to work with the layout. I want to work with anchors and then a custom anchor. To place a node right in the center of the window, you want to set all of these points to 0.5. 0.5, 0.5, and 0.5. Now the green needle is right in the middle of the window. Besides that, for the anchor offsets, I want to get rid of right and bottom. Now we are literally right in the center of the window. And after we have that, I want to set a custom minimum size of 100 and 100. We are nearly done. If I run the scene now, we do have an orange rectangle that's roughly in the middle, but the issue is only the top left is in the middle. The rectangle itself is offset from that, which isn't ideal yet. And that happened because the grow direction is right and bottom. Meaning at the moment, our custom minimum size is exceeding the size that we are getting from the anchor points. And we are growing to the right and to the bottom of that. To fix that, I want to grow in both directions. And now the rectangle is literally right in the center of the window, which works pretty well. That would be the first rectangle. Next up, I want to add another color rectangle, which is going to be the green rectangle. This one should always be in the bottom left. With a 5% offset from the left and the bottom, it should cover 50% of the width of the window and 10% of the height. First of all, let's change the color to green, so we want less red and blue, and then get a greenish color that doesn't look horrible. That looks about alright. After that, we have a layout. We want anchors. Anchor preset should be custom. And I want to get rid of the offset for right and bottom. After that, for the anchor points, I want to have a distance to the left of 5%, so 0.05, to get 50% of the window width. I want to set the right side to 0.55. That way we cover 50% of the window width with the 5% offset to the left. Finally, I want this rectangle to cover 10% of the window height and also have a 5% offset to the bottom, which means the bottom of the rectangle should be 0.95. That way, we're getting a 5% offset to the bottom. And to only get 10% height, this value should be 0.85. That way, the distance between the top and the bottom is 10% of the window width. And with that, we are done. I can now resize all of this, and we are always in the right position. That looks pretty good. That means finally we can add another color rectangle for the blue rectangle. First of all, for the color, this one should be bluish. Let's make it a bit darker, something like that. For this rectangle, we want to be 5% from the top and 15 pixels from the right. Important here, we are working with pixels, not percentages. Same with the width. This rectangle should always be 200 pixels wide. Finally, we have a 15% offset from the bottom. This should be fairly easy. Which means, for this rectangle, I want to have an anchor layout once again with a custom preset. For the offsets, I don't want to have any. I want to start working with the anchor points. The easy parts are the top and the bottom. Those are simple percentages, so we can simply add 5%, 0.05, and for the bottom, 0.85. That way we are getting a 5 and 15% offset from the top and bottom. That part was easy, but left and right are a bit more difficult. First of all, I want this rectangle to always be on the right side, which means left and right, in my case, are both going to be 1. That means we are now on the right side. That's a good start, but we don't have any width. Now we could get that by reducing the left size. But these numbers are relative. And since I want to have a pixel size, this isn't good enough. For that, we want to work with anchor offsets, where we first of all set a right side to -15. That way we are getting 15 pixels offset to the right, which is a good start, but this is still not visible. We have to set a custom minimum size. This one should be 200 pixels. This is not going to work for now though. If I run the scene, we can't see the blue rectangle because it's to the right of the window. And that happens because our custom minimum size is exceeding what we're getting from the anchor points. And the grow direction is set to right. As a consequence, we are growing to the right of the window. This should be left, and then this is looking much better. If I now run the scene again, we're getting a blue rectangle, and this is always 200 pixels wide and to the right of the window. And that is looking pretty good. Which means with that, we have covered the absolute basics of layouts. If you understand this system, you already have a really good start. Now, before we finish, we have to talk about these two buttons really quickly. The first button is simply giving you all of the presets. You can use that by, let me add another color rectangle. By simply clicking, for example, on this one, then we're filling the entire window. And if you click on the center one, then we are right in the center. Very hard to see right now because we have the orange rectangle. But now we have a color rectangle for the center, and in there, if you go to layout, we have the center point. You could change this to custom and then change it to whatever you need. But you can see here, this is pretty much the same thing that we have done, which means this button is pretty easy. I guess just to see something, let's change the left side to 0.4 and the top side to 0.4 as well. So with that, we have a proper rectangle again. Next up, we have the anchor button, and if you have this one selected, meaning it's blue, and you drag any of these red points, then you're also dragging the anchor points with it. So you can see if I'm moving the red points, any of them would do. We are also moving the anchor points. However, if I don't have that anchor selected and I move the red points, then we don't move the anchors. Instead, we would move the offsets. Pretty straightforward as well. And that's pretty much it. With that, we have basic layouts, so next up, we can work on containers. Containers take over the anchors to place nodes in a specific way. In lots of UIs, you want to place nodes in a very specific way. For example, you might want some kind of grid layout, or you might want a horizontal layout, where the nodes are arranged in a very specific system. All of that could be achieved using anchors in a system that you have just seen. But that would be a terrible idea, it would simply take forever. Instead, you are supposed to use containers, which make all of this significantly easier. So containers simply provide an automatic arrangement of control nodes. For example, we have an HBox container, which arranges any amount of control nodes in a horizontal layout. That's pretty much it, it's super straightforward. Although, while using this system, you have to understand that the layout system changes inside of a container a little bit. Instead of defining relative distances via anchors, you are setting the expansion behavior. Or in other words, for the HBox container, you could set some nodes to expand and others to not expand. That way, in this example, the first rectangle tries to take as much space as possible, while the other rectangles are defined by their custom minimum size. And that's basically it. There are loads of containers you could be working with, but none of them are terribly difficult. Back inside of Godot, I don't need Basics UI anymore. Instead, I want to create another user interface and rename it to containers. We can save it right away inside of one basics in there, containers.tscn. With that, we have a basic layout scene, and that's a pretty good start. Let me add just a bit more space. That looks good. If I now add a node and look for control, the first node in there is container. And this container has a whole bunch of children. These are all of the containers that we could be working with. Actually, quite a few more children, so we have lots of containers to work with. One of the easiest would be a VBox and an HBox container. Those align their children either on the horizontal or on the vertical axis. I guess we could start with a VBox container, but the system would also work for an HBox container. With that, we have a container and we can't see very much. To get started, I want to give this thing a layout, which should be anchors and custom. Left and top can stay the same, but for the right, I want to have 0.3 and for the bottom 0.49. Also, I want to get rid of the anchor offsets, so we have a more straightforward space. Now we're covering roughly 1/6 of the space of the scene. This part wasn't strictly necessary, I just wanted to have a bit more space. Now, to the important part. Whenever you add a child to a container, for example, we could add a color rectangle, then we are getting different behavior. For this color rectangle, because it's a child of a container, we don't get the anchors anymore. Or in other words, if you go to layout, you get this node is a child of a container, so we cannot use transform or anything in here really. We don't get layout mode at all. Also, if you look at the top, we don't have the anchors anymore. Instead, what we get is horizontal and vertical alignment. The same thing we get in the inspector. Those two are very similar. You get a few more options inside of the inspector. So in here, you can tell this node to fill the entire horizontal and vertical space and the stretch ratio. To see something, I want to stretch this thing out on the vertical axis. And then we are filling the entire size of the VBox container using this one rectangle. And if I duplicate the color rectangle, you can see that we are getting multiple nodes that are all separated by a very small space. What is happening here is that we have 5 color rectangles, and they divide the vertical space of this container equally among them. That is because they were all set to expand. Other things you could be doing in here, for example, if I set for the last color rectangle the container sizing not to expand, then this container is not going to be visible because it's not expanding and the custom minimum size is 0. If I set this to 200, then this container is going to be much larger, simply because the minimum size is really, really large in relative terms. What you could also do, if I set this to expand, then you can set the stretch ratio. Via that, you can tell this node to take up more space. If you're setting it to a 2, then it's going to take up twice as much space as its siblings. And that is more or less it for a container. They don't really get that much more complicated. Now, I guess for the VBox container itself, we have the alignment where we have begin, center, and end. The way those are working, if I only have 2 color rectangles, which both have a custom minimum size of, let's say, 100, like so, and I don't want to set them to expand. That way, we only get 2 vertical color rectangles. And via this alignment, we can tell if they start at the beginning, the center, or the end. And I think all of this is fairly straightforward. Containers aren't that complicated. Which means, next up, we can learn about another container, one that you are going to use a lot, a grid container. And for this one, like I've done before, let's organize all of this a bit better. I want to go to custom layout, no offsets. The top is going to be 0.5, right is going to be 0.3, and the bottom is going to be 1. Also, I don't want any offsets. Once again, that way we have a bit more space to work with. Now, inside of a grid container, we are arranging nodes via a grid, which means if I add a color rectangle, we can give this a custom minimum size of, let's say, 100 by 100 pixels. Then we can see it again. And if I now duplicate it, we are placing them below each other. That is because inside of the grid container, we currently only have a single column. But if I set this column to, let's say, 3, then I can keep on duplicating them, and we keep on having more rows, always with 3 columns. On top of that, you can also set the expansion behavior for horizontal and vertical alignments like you have seen before. If you activate those, the node will try to take up as much space as possible. If you play around with these numbers, they should be fairly straightforward. And also, if you look at the other containers, they all work in roughly a similar way. For example, we have a container that always centers all of its elements. We have a container that adds a margin to it. We can add a panel behind it, more on that later. We can also scroll, and so on. I will talk about those in a bit more detail later on, but if you understand the basics, you could figure them out on your own pretty easily. Now, before we continue, there's one more thing that I do want to cover, and that is, I simply want to add a simple control node. And once again, arrange it so we have a bit more organized space. I want to have a custom size, no offsets. The left should be 0.35. The top should be 0, the right should be 0.7, and the bottom 0.49. That is going to give us another area, and this area is not a container, it's simply a control node. Inside of this control node, we can add a color rectangle. And now, when we are using any of these presets, for example, the full rect one, we are only filling the parent container. We're not filling the entire screen. And that is important. These layouts are always relative to the parent container. If the node doesn't have an obvious node container, then you are usually working with the screen. But once you have a container, you are constrained by the size of that container. And adding a control node to another control node keeps on giving you all of these anchor points. So for example, in there, we can give it half of the height, whatever you need, really. Now, what is incredibly useful is that you can combine this system with the containers. For example, what if you want to have just a bit more control over this one rectangle in the bottom right? Selecting it reveals that we don't have access to the anchors. We can only set the horizontal and the vertical alignment. But I want to have access to the actual anchors. How could we get that? All I have to do is get rid of this one rectangle and replace it with a control node. For this control node, I want to have a custom minimum size of 100 and 100. So we have basically what we had before, except now we cannot see the color of the color rectangle. We have an empty space. And this empty space is defined by the horizontal and the vertical alignment. Once again, we don't get access to the anchors, which is fine because what we can now do is add a child to this control node, which could be a color rectangle, and let me highlight it with a color. Let's make this one yellow. For this color rectangle, the child of the control node, we have regained access to the anchors, which means now I can set a full rectangle and then change this however I like. For example, if I go to layout, I can customize this. And then for the anchor points, I could even set something like 1.5 in here. Then we go further to the right. I guess I should have mentioned earlier, these numbers only on the slider go from 0 to 1, but you can make them larger. This could be 100, and then you get a really, really wide rectangle. Usually not something you want to do, but I guess sometimes it can be incredibly helpful. You also get the offsets, and those work just as before. And well, with that system, you can work with containers, but also retaining access to anchors, which is a really powerful system. I guess I should make this a bit less horrible looking. Let's do this at 1 and 1, and then 15 and 20. That looks a little bit better. Cool, so with that, we have containers, and we are working with children of control nodes, which you can all combine fairly straightforwardly. That means now we just have to learn about a few more other containers, and then we have this part covered. Let me skip ahead a tiny bit. I have added 3 more containers: a margin container, a center container, and a scroll container. First of all, the margin container. If I add a color rectangle to this one, we are filling the entire space. And let's change the color, make this look a bit less monotone. Now we're getting a color, and that's kind of it. Inside of layout, we can't do very much. We could change any of these numbers, but they literally don't do anything. So how can we work with a margin container? How does it actually work? And well, for that, in just a bit, we're going to learn about theming. That way you can change the values of this container. Although for now, you can simply go to theme override, constants, and they can set the margins. And then give this thing a margin of really whatever you want. Let's go with 30 and 30 there. All that this container does is it, well, adds a margin around the container. That's literally it. Next up, we have a center container. Let's add a color rectangle to this one. We can change the color as well, I guess, to, let's go with green, like so. Cool. Now we technically have a color rectangle, but we cannot see it. So what happened here? And well, a center container always centers the node inside of it. On top of that, it scales the node to the minimum possible size. And in our case, the rectangle has a custom minimum size of 0 and 0. And that's the size that we are getting. If I change this to 50 and 50, Now we can see it again. And you can also see it is centered inside of the center container, which I guess makes sense. Finally, we have a scroll container. Although once you add it, Godot is going to give you a warning that this node is supposed to work with another container style node, like VBox or HBox. Which means let's give it a VBox container, and this VBox container should scale the entire size of the parent container. And now to this VBox container, we can add a color rectangle. But now you have to be careful, because if I set this to expand, then we are simply filling the entire space and we are kind of breaking the scroll behavior. Effectively, what's happening now is because of this scroll container, we're getting infinite vertical space that we are organizing via the VBox container. But if we then add one element that expands to fill this entire space, we are filling up basically infinite space, which obviously isn't going to work terribly well. That means if you're working inside of a scroll container, you don't want things to expand. Instead, you should rather set the custom minimum size to, let's say, 100. And if I now duplicate the color rectangle a couple of times, you can see we have a scroll bar. And if I run the scene, we can work with that scroll bar super easily. So these would be a couple of examples where you want to be just a bit more careful with containers. But fundamentally, they aren't that complicated. So let's do an exercise, and then we are done with the basics of containers. I want you to create 3 container layouts, the one that you can see on the screen right now. Once again, this should take you a few minutes. Pause the video now and see how far you get. Righty, let's get started with the first one. I want to have 3 items filling a space vertically, and the last item expands to the right by 200 extra pixels. For all of that, I want to create a new user interface. Let's call it container exercise. In there, I want to create a VBox container, which I want to scale up a bit. For that, I want to have this symbol selected and then drag this thing out just a bit so we cover roughly a third of the window. Also, then go to Layout, Anchor Offsets. I don't want to have any anchor offsets. Cool. With that, we have a VBox container, and now to this VBox container, we can add a color rectangle, which I want to expand, meaning we are taking up as much space as possible. This we can then duplicate twice, and then we are separating the space in 3 parts, which is a good start, but for the last container, I want a bit more space to the right. For that, I want to get rid of the last color rectangle and replace it with a simple control node. This control node should also expand. Inside of it, I want to add a color rectangle, which then has access to all of the anchors again, which means I want to get the full rectangle and also change the color. I guess this one can be blue-ish. After we have that, to get to 200 pixels to the right, I want to set the full rect, custom, and then go to anchor offsets and give it 200 pixels to the right. And there we go. We now have a fairly flexible custom layout. Next up, the center layout. 3 items filling a space horizontally and a 10 pixel margin to each side of the main container. Or in other words, this green space around it. For that, first of all, I want to add a margin container, which once again, with the anchor selected, I want to drag out so we are covering some center space. I guess this is roughly all right. Also, I don't want to have any anchor offsets. Once we have that, as a child to the margin container, I want to add a VBox container. Actually, an HBox container, I think. We want the 3 items in the middle to be arranged on the horizontal axes. I want to add a color rectangle that should be expanding on the horizontal axes. Then I want to duplicate it 3 times. And now we have 3 color rectangles on this axis. Finally, for the margin container, I want to go to Theme Override and then set a size of 10 pixels for all of them. And that way, we're getting the horizontal arrangement in the center, along with a margin around it. I guess this part is a bit difficult to see, but you can very much see once you select them that we have a bit of a margin around them. That means we can work on the final layout, where we have a grid with 2 columns that fills the entire container. And on top of that, we have a red square in the bottom left that goes outside of the container. For that, I want to add a control node that I will arrange using the anchor roughly on the right side of the window. Also for layout, I don't want to have any offsets. That looks about right. After we have that, I want to add a grid container that takes up the full rectangle of the parent container. This grid container should also have 2 columns. Once we have that, I can add a color rectangle to it and set the color rectangle to take up as much space as possible. With that, I can duplicate the color rectangle a couple of times. Once we have 6 children, this looks pretty good. That being said, the one thing missing is the rectangle in the bottom left. I want to minimize the grid container and add another child to the parent control node. This is also going to be a color rectangle. And this color rectangle is relative to the parent, this control node, not the grid container, because it's not a child of it. I guess to make this a bit more visible, let's make this thing red. There we go. And now, since the parent container is simply a control node, not a container, we can work with the anchors. I want to place this in the bottom left. Then we can go to Layout and set a custom layout where the grow direction should be both and both. Now we can get rid of top and right and instead set a custom minimum size of, let's say, 50 and 50. That way we are exactly in the bottom left, or the center of this red rectangle is in the bottom left of the container, and we are growing around that point. And with that, we have created some pretty fancy containers. So I hope the overall logic here is fairly straightforward. If you're playing around with this one, it becomes straightforward really, really fast. If you now learn about all of the available layout nodes, you can literally create any kind of layout. That's going to be the next part. Now that we have the basic logic of layouts, we can work with the actual layout nodes. There aren't that many and they're not that complicated, so this part should be fairly straightforward. If you ever worked with 2D nodes, you should feel right at home. Here we are back in Godot, and I want to go to 2 UI nodes, the folder, and in there we have common nodes.tscn. If you open this one, you can see basically all of the UI nodes that you are ever going to use. It's not literally all of them, but the ones that I'm not covering are something like a video player. Or we also have a code editor, things that aren't really necessary for basically any game. Just keep in mind, there are a few more, but they don't really matter. And well, for the next few minutes, we are going to go through all of them. Starting with the label. This is some very basic text, and that's literally all it does. In the inspector, you have a text field, and in there, you can type whatever. Pretty easy. On top of that, if you go down a bit in the inspector, you get loads more options. For example, there's the horizontal alignment. Right now it's left, and if I set this to center, then nothing happens. That is because right now the text fills the entire available space. If I expand this, you can see this quite a bit better. Now we are centered, we have right, left, and fill. So if you need something specific, just go through this and see what you need. It's all fairly straightforward. Now, one thing that you might be wondering is how can you customize this text? And for that, we are going to look at themes later on. But just for now, if you go a bit down, there's theme override, and in there, you can change a lot more about how the text looks. But not something I'm going to work on for now. And that's pretty much text. It doesn't really do that much. It's, well, text. That being said, there is a fancy text node called Rich Text Label. This one right now doesn't look terribly impressive. We get some text, and then color green and wave and lots of weird stuff. These bits are called BB code that we can enable. If we do that, we are getting some cool effects. If you look at the documentation, you can find lots of examples and instructions on how to make basically any kind of text effect. You also get lots more options inside of the inspector, so play around with this one if you like it. After that, we have line edit. This lets you enter text, which means if I run the scene, I can type something in here. That also works really well. On top of that, inside of the line edit node, you have lots of options that you could be working with. And even more interestingly, if you go to node, you have a ton of signals that you could be using. In fact, let's try one. Inside of the parent node, we have a script that is at the moment literally entirely empty besides extends control. Which means with line edit selected, I can get text change connected to the parent node, and then we have a new text parameter that we can literally just print. So print new text, and now if I run the scene, I can type stuff again, and we always get whatever was typed in. This we can also connect to other nodes. For example, I could get the label and then update the text of it to be the new text that we get from line edit. Let's try this one, and then we get something cool. Quite nice. Once again, I don't think any of this is too complicated. Speaking of not being complicated, besides line edit, we also have text edit, which is pretty much the same thing except over multiple lines. Or in other words, if you want to enter more complex text, this is the node for you. Other than that, it works like line edit, except you have more options. That's literally it. After that, we have an H separator. This is literally just a line. In fact, I've used this a couple of times. We have an H separator and we have a V separator. Those are literally just lines that help you organize the layout a bit better. It doesn't do anything, it's just a line that's very easily usable. Next up, we have a node you are going to use a lot, a texture rectangle. This one is the easiest way to display text. It's basically the sprite 2D of layout nodes. In there, you have a texture, and in this texture, you can add whatever you want. I used the Godot logo, but if you go to graphics, there's lots more that you could be using. For example, if I add the texture in there, we get a different graphic. Besides that, you have two really important options, expand mode and stretch mode. Expand mode tells you in which way we are expanding. Most importantly in here, do you want to fit the width or the height of the available space? Besides that, we have stretch mode, and in there, you can either scale the node, or you can keep the aspect ratio, or you can keep it centered, or all of those combined. We are going to use this node quite a bit, but definitely something you want to play around with. Other than that, it doesn't really do very much. It's really just a picture. Besides that, we have a panel. And this also doesn't do very much. It's, well, even less than a picture. In fact, if you look at the inspector, we don't really have any options for it. We only get the normal layout stuff to place it, but that's about it. That is because a panel is just an empty space that you can customize. If you go to theme overrides and styles, right now I have given this a style box flat, but if I disable it, you can see a default panel node. It's just a grayish box. This grayish box you're supposed to style via any of these options, style box flat, and in there you can set all of the styling, and that's literally all it does. You're probably not going to use panels that much, but if you just need some kind of plain color in the background or something with a border or a shadow, you would use a panel. Next up, we have what is called a 9-patch rectangle. This one is actually very similar to a texture rectangle, except it does one extra thing. And I can demonstrate that actually by taking the texture rectangle and scaling it. If I do that, we are scaling the thing while keeping the aspect ratio. That is because of this aspect ratio. If I set this to just scale, then we are literally scaling it to whatever we have available. In 9-patch rectangle works a bit differently. In there, if I scale it, we are doing something slightly different. Look especially at the top parts. In there, we are adding more of these little increment thingies. Same with the sides. Effectively what this one is doing. If I go to region, it separates an image into 9 parts. And then when you scale it, it either tiles or stretches the borders. That way you can create a graphic of any size while maintaining really nice looking borders and edges. This is the kind of thing you are going to use for pretty much any kind of speech bubble. Because that way you can add as much content as you want inside of the node without messing up the corners. Super useful. Other than that, it doesn't really do very much. It's still just a graphic. We're going to talk about this one in more detail later on, especially when it comes to the dialogue game. But that's going to be later. Next up, I want to look at buttons. And we have a very simple button that has some text, and that's about it. Besides that, we have signals where we can check for button up, button down, pressed, and toggled. The easiest one, I guess, is pressed. If I connect this to the parent node, we can print button was pressed. If I now run the scene, I can click on the button, and we get button was pressed. You can also add an icon to the button and change the text behavior, but I think none of that is too complicated. Besides that, there are quite a few button variations. Or in other words, if you go to the nodes and you find base button, you have the basic button, and if you expand this one, you have lots of variations, like a checkbox button, a check button, a color picker button, and so on. All of these pretty much work like a button, so if you understand that one, you should be good to go. For example, we have a check button. In there, we can once again add some text and an icon. And if you go to node, we have the same options. Let's try to connect pressed here, and then print check button was pressed. Let's try and see what we get. If I now click on this button, we get check button was pressed with more of an indicator what's happening. And that's just about it for this one. Next up, we have the menu button. And this one does get a bit more complex. Mostly because inside of the inspector, you can set some items. I have item 1, item 2, and if I now run the thing, I can click on the menu button and we get item 1 and item 2. If I add another element, let's call it item 3, I can run the thing again, and then we get item 3 as well. In other words, this menu button gives you a menu via a button. Fairly straightforward. And very similar to it, we have this one here, the option button. Just like before, we can set some items, and those are going to be visible when this button is clicked. So I can click on it, and we can set item 1 or item 2. The next button is going to be a texture button. For this one, if you look at the inspector, the most important part is textures. There we can set a normal, pressed, hover, and disabled. There's also focused and click masked. I'll talk about those later. But for now, if I run the game and I hover over this button, we get a slightly different color, and if I press the button, we are getting a different graphic, depending on what you have set in here. Also, if you disable the button with this toggle, then you get the other graphic as well. Other than that though, it's really just a button, so you get the same signals that you have seen from the button already. Super straightforward. After that, we have two slightly weirder buttons with a color picker button. For that one, let me run the thing. If I click on this area, we're getting a color picker. For this one, if you look at the signals, you also get color changed. That way you can capture what was done in here. And finally, we have a link button. This one links to a website. In this case, the Godot engine, meaning if I run all of this, I can click on it, and we open the Godot website. That's really it. We are making progress. Next up, we have a whole bunch of progress bars. A progress bar simply lets you display numbers inside of some kind of bar thing. So in there, usually you have a minimum value, a maximum value, a step size, and a value. The value is what is actually important. You also get fill mode, where you can make this thing look a bit different, depending on what you need, along with a couple of extra options, but none of that is too important. A slightly more advanced version of the progress bar is the texture progress bar. For this one, you can set textures for under, over, and progress. Under is the background, and progress is what's actually visible. So in this case, that would be the green bar. Over will then be displayed on top of everything else, but other than that, doesn't really do anything. You can also set a stretch margin, and that is kind of it for the most part. That being said, inside of this project, we have two texture progress bar, one for a bar and one for a circle. That you get via the fill mode. If you click on that one, you get a whole bunch of options. Clockwise makes the bar, well, clockwise. And in there, you can update the value and then work with this clock depending on what kind of graphic you are using. In this case, we have a graphic for under and for progress, and this is what you see. Now for this one, you do have to be careful what kind of graphic you are using. If I have this graphic and use left to right, then this is going to look, let's say, a bit strange. I guess it could work once in a while. But just make sure you know what you are doing here. Otherwise, this is going to look quite strange. Next up, we have H slider. This is an input element where the user can select a number from a range. In fact, if I run the game, we are working with this element here, and we can simply drag it to whatever value we want. For this one, we have a minimum and a maximum value, and a value that we are actually setting. For all of that, we also get a whole bunch of signals, and the most important one in there is drag ended and value changed. If I connect value changed, then I can, let me add a bit of space. We can print the current value. Let me try all of that. I can drag this thing, and we're getting the value that we have set in there. Something, once again, you can also connect to the texture progress bars. And in there, you want to update the value, which we want to set to the value that we're getting from the parameter. And I guess while we are here, we can do the same thing to the other progress bar with this same line. Let's try this again. And now, whenever I change this number, we are updating the two texture progress bars. Pretty neat. After that, we have a spin box, which does a very similar thing. In fact, if I run the project, we have simply a spin box where we can increase or decrease the number. Like for the H slider, you can check if the value changed, and in the inspector, you have a few more options, but that's kind of it. After that, we have a simple item list, and in there, we can display a whole bunch of items. If you look at items, there I have set a couple, and that's more or less it. I guess if you look at the signals, you can click and select items, and then you get a return value. Not too complicated. Next up, we have something much more interesting, and that is a sub-viewport container along with a spatial scene viewport, which is an entirely separate scene. What happens here? Let me click on it and then go to 3D mode. In there, you can see we have a spatial scene viewport, a world environment, directional light 3D, a camera, and a mesh instance 3D. The mesh instance 3D is what we are actually seeing, and this one has a material to make it look a bit more interesting, but that's kind of it. Via a spatial scene viewport, you can use a sub-viewport container and then display a 3D object inside of 2D space. If you click on the spatial scene viewport, you also get a few more options. For example, in my case, I enabled transparent background. There's loads more, but Transparent BG is the one that you are going to use the most, I think. And basically all that's happening in here is that we are displaying whatever the camera 3D captures, the one that is current. You can also make this more interesting if you give the mesh instance 3D a script. Let's create it. And then inside of process, we can rotate Y by the delta value. Save all of this, go back to common nodes, run this, and then we get a rotating effect. Looks pretty neat. Although not something I want to do for now. Let me add pass in here so the scene doesn't get too cluttered. And well, that is pretty much it for sub viewport container. The only thing that you have to remember is when you have a 3D scene, the parent node should be a spacious scene viewport. After that, you add all of the 3D stuff that you want to add, and then you can display the thing. Now we are going to use this system a lot later on for the Zelda style menu. I guess one thing that can be quite confusing is when you use transparent background, then inside of this 3D scene for the lighting, you will end up with background canvas, which looks quite strong. And if I don't set a strong ambient light, let me set this one to default, then we get an entirely black cube. So if your background is transparent, you want to set color here and then use a fairly strong one. I went with white, so it's more neutral. That way we get this final result. Next up, we have two slightly less important nodes. We have a reference rectangle, which doesn't do very much. This one is just for testing purposes. Effectively, it's a placeholder that you can place in certain positions. It's not going to be visible in the actual game. If I run this, you cannot see anything. And it's just telling you how large things are going to be. And that's literally it. And finally, we have tree. This one can become a bit more complex, but effectively, you are displaying information in here via a tree. Unfortunately, if you look at the inspector, you can't simply add items to it. Instead, to work with this one, you have to write some GD script. For that, if I go to this script part and add func_ready. For this one, we can grab the tree and use that to create a root element, which I want to store in a variable var root is going to be tree and then create item. If I now run the project, you can see that we have one thing here inside of this containery thingy. Although this one doesn't do very much at the moment. You want to add a section. Let's call this one section. I want to get the tree once again and then create an item. And for create item, you can set a parent. And I want this section to be part of the root node. Which means in there, I want to have root. If I now run this again, we have two items and this is collapsible. And to actually see something, I want to get the section we just created and then set_text with 0 and section 1. If I now run this again, we get section 1. And this once again is collapsible, so we are getting a bit more information in here. Now, this 0 is the column, and we can add multiple columns to this tree item. For that, all the way at the top, I want to get the tree and then set columns. In my case, I want to have 3. And after we have that, I can duplicate set text and change this to 1 and 2, where we can add stuff and things, run the entire thing again, and then we get section 1, stuff and things. And effectively, you keep on building this thing up via GDScript and add more and more elements. If you style it, this could, for example, be a quest log. But I guess all of that becomes quite boring and a bit more advanced. So I'm going to finish it here. And well, with that, we have all of the basic UI nodes in Godot. Once again, there are a few more that you should be aware of, but those are the ones you are going to use 99% of the time. Now, before we continue, the debugger isn't happy because inside of this script, we are not using delta. They've made an underscore, so Godot stops complaining. And then we have covered another important part. Although, before we continue, there is another scene called Advanced Containers. If I open this one and give myself a bit more space, we have a couple more containers that I do want to talk about. First of all, we have the HFlow container. That is this one here in the top. And if you just look at it, it looks like a very basic grid container, like we're going to use in just a second here. The difference here is that this one tries to add as many elements on one line, and if it runs out of space, it goes to the next line immediately. If I get rid of almost all of the color rectangles, bar the first one, where we have a custom minimum size of 50 and 50. If I duplicate this one a couple of times, we are always on the first line, but at some point we are on the second one, and this will continue forever. This item adds things to a line. Once it runs out of space, it goes to the next one. If you want to create a hard system like in Zelda, this is the container you would be using. Next up, we have a split container. This one is interesting because of split offset. You can either display one thing or another thing, and then work between the two. In my case, I have two color rectangles with different colors, but you could have much larger setups in here. I guess the usage of this one is fairly specific, but sometimes it can be super useful. Next up, we have the scroll container once again. Except this one, we're using a grid container. And because of that, we can scroll up and down and left and right. I guess this one we have already seen. I just wanted to show you can also use a grid container with a scroll container. Next up, we have the tab container. For this one, we are also going to learn about a different node called a tab bar. And as a child of the tab bar, we have a color rectangle. And this color rectangle is going to be displayed when we have the tab bar selected. Or in other words, if I run this, we have tab bar 2, and tab bar 3, and those display different information. Essentially, for a tab container, you want to add a couple of children with a tab bar, and then you can customize them. Next up, we have two more containers that are largely used for styling. The first one is a panel container. And as a reminder, earlier we have already seen a panel. Inside of common nodes, a panel was this one here. A very basic graphic that you can style, but that doesn't do anything besides that. A panel container works pretty much the same way. Effectively, it does two things. So inside of this one, I have some very basic text. And the panel container wraps exactly around the size of this node, and it can be styled. Those are the only two things it's going to do. For example, if I change the size of the text to make it single line, then the panel container is going to still be in the background. And this background we can customize via theme override, styles, and there we can give it a style box flat. And now we can give the text some background and make it whatever color you want. That way, it becomes super easy to add any kind of background to a node. And well, that is pretty much it for this part. Finally, we have a super specific node aspect ratio container. This one wants to have one child, and it forces a certain aspect ratio on that child. In my case, the aspect ratio is going to be 1, meaning this color rectangle will always be a perfect rectangle. In other words, the width and the height of this thing is always going to be identical. But I can set the ratio to 2, then it's going to be twice as wide as it's tall. And you can make this as wide as you want. This could be 100, then we get a horizontal line. Now, this aspect ratio container is super specific, and you're not going to use it very often. Especially if you look at texture rectangles. For the stretch mode, you can keep the aspect ratio as well, which is what you want to use most of the time. So when you're working with images, this one is kind of superfluous. I guess sometimes you really want to have a very specific aspect ratio, then you are going to use it, but it's not going to be very often. And well, with that, we have basically all of the UI nodes that you are ever going to use. Now, before we continue, one more small thing that I want to cover, and that is layouts and GDScript. Basically, all layouts can be accessed via code super easily. This would, for example, look like this, where you take a control node and then set anchor right to whatever value you need. There are a couple more examples like offset bottom and the preset. Details on all of these you can find on this link. This link will lead you to a really long website, and in there, most of the time, you just want to look for the option that works for you. Like, for example, anchor_right. Here you can see we get anchor right with a short description, and all you really need to do is assign a value to it, and then you're good to go. There are loads more options, just choose whatever you need. And for a demonstration, back inside of Godot, I want to create another scene and call it UI code. Save this one inside of UI nodes. UI_code.tscn is totally fine. And in there, I want to add another color rectangle. The size doesn't really matter. Instead, I want to add a script to the scene. UICode.gd is totally fine inside of the same folder. Click on create. And we only want to work inside of the ready function. Let me add just a bit more space so you can see what's going on, like so. That works. And basically, all you have to do is take a control node and then dot anchor right, for example, or really whatever anchor you want to target. This value you could set, for example, to 1, and then run the scene, and you should cover the entire width of the window. So by default, our color rectangle looks like this, but because we are updating the right anchor, we are covering the entire width of the window. Another thing that you could be doing, let me comment this one out and get the color rectangle again. You can set the anchor presets and the anchor and offsets presets. In my case, I'm going to go with set anchor presets, and then we get control and all of the presets. I want to go with full rectangle, and then as a second argument, we have to set a boolean if we want to keep the offsets. By default, this one is false, but I want to set it to true. And with that, if I run the entire thing, our color rectangle covers the entire window. And for the final example, we can get the color rectangle again, and then get offset on any of the sides. Let's go with offset right, and for this one, I want to set a value of -300. That way, we are getting 300 pixels to the right. I think all of this is fairly straightforward. There's just one more thing I want to cover, and that is I want to add a VBox container and place it somewhere on the right. So let's place it via the preset and then go to layout with custom anchors and then set the left side to 0.7. Looks about alright, and after that, I want to add a whole bunch of color rectangles to it that are all set to expand on the vertical alignment. Let's duplicate it. I guess we can go with 5. Since we are now using a container, the layout options are different. Now, instead of using the anchors, we get container sizing. If you hover over these options, you get the option that you can work with. Or in other words, what you could be doing is, for example, get the first color rectangle and then target the stretch ratio via size flex stretch ratio. By default, this value is 1.0, but if I set it, for example, to 3 and run the entire thing, then you can see that the first color rectangle is much larger. Since all of these are white, this is quite hard to see, but if I set the offset right to, let's say, -500, we should get a bit more space. Yeah, that's much better. So by default, all of the color rectangles should have the same height. But since we are updating the stretch ratio of the first rectangle, this one is going to be much larger. And that's kind of all you have to know about using GDScript with layouts. There isn't anything complicated, you just update values from the inspector and then you're good to go. So with that, we have covered all of the basics of layouts. That means next up, we can work on themes and styling. Next up, we are going to theme our nodes. That way, you can make look everything really nice or really weird, depending on what you're into. And to achieve all of that, we have to use themes. Now, themes let you change the style of basically every part of a layout node. You can either override the theme of a single node, or you can apply a theme to a node and then make it apply to all of its children. You can also set a theme for the entire project. It's fairly easily done. For all of that, here we are back in Godot, and I want to go to folder 3, themes. And there we have theme.tscn, which contains 3 things. We have a panel, a label, and a hidden text box that I want to ignore for now, but that's what it looks like. We'll change the style of this thing in just a bit. For now though, I want to ignore it. Instead, I want to work with the panel and give it a custom style. For that, in the inspector, we have 2 things. We can give it a theme or a theme override. Applying a theme to it would be a larger thing, so we will do that later. For now, I want to override the theme of this specific node, and that we can do via theme override. We only have one option in here, the panel, and in there we have 4 options. Now, pretty much always you want to use a style box flat. This one contains all of the actual useful options, like a background color. We have a border color, a corner radius, we can set shadows, and so on. This is what you are going to use most of the time because most of the good options are in here. Besides that, you also have a style box texture. That way, you can assign a texture to this panel. For example, the Godot logo, you can simply drag in here, and then change a few more minor things. This can very rarely be useful, but most of the time, simply using a texture rectangle would be more straightforward. Besides that, you have a style box empty, which literally doesn't do anything. And then you have a style box line, which displays a line for some reason. If I make this thing white and increase the thickness, they can see we literally have a line that's either horizontal or vertical. I have absolutely no idea why this is in there, but somebody must have thought this was a good idea. Anyway, we want to work with style box flat. And in there, we can, for example, set the background color to something like, let's go with a greenish color. We can skew the entire thing to make it look a bit stranger. We can set a corner radius with 10, 10, 10, and 10. And importantly, this corner detail tells you how round the corners are going to be. If I zoom into this corner and reduce the corner detail, then you can see we're getting sharper corners, which can be a nice effect. So that's already kind of interesting. And if you increase this value, you get more rounded corners. 8 is usually a pretty good middle value that looks alright. You can also set a border width and a border color. Let's go with 5 on each side and give it a different kind of color. I guess that looks okay. And finally, we can give it a shadow, where we can also set the color. In my case, I just want to reduce the opacity by a bit. And there we go. With that, we have styled a panel and made it look much more interesting. Since a panel doesn't really do that much, the styling options are also a bit more limited. After all, a panel is really just a plain rectangle that we can style. Other layout nodes are a bit more involved. For example, a label, the one that we have down here saying some text, also has a theme override, and in there we get loads more options. For example, we can set the font color to, let's go with red. We can set an outline size. And we can apply a style to it, like we have seen before. And this one would give this thing a background that we could make quite bright. I don't know, something like that. I hope you get the idea. Basically, for theme override, Godot is giving you lots of options and you can work with them. Depending on a node, you get more or less options, really whatever is available. In fact, some layout nodes don't have any. A good example here would be a texture rectangle. Since this one is just a picture, you don't get theme override. In fact, when you set a theme, it wouldn't do anything. Simply because the entire styling comes from the picture. There's nothing to customize here. And well, with that, we have basic theming in place. But this would be kind of annoying if you have a more complex object, like this text box here, for example. Ideally for this one, I would like to apply a theme to the text box, and this one changes the entire thing in one go. That we can do via the theme. If you click on Theme and Theme on the drop-down menu, you can create a new theme. On the drop-down menu, you can also save it as, let's call it custom underscore theme, and then save it. Now we have a theme, and if you have that selected, you get loads of options in the bottom. The idea is that you select a couple of layout nodes and then you style them. For example, in this text box, we have a panel container, a margin container, a VBox container, then we have a texture rectangle, a label, and a couple of buttons. All of those I want to style via the theme, which means I can, for example, grab the panel container and add the type. That way, we have the type inside of this theme. And if you look at the options down here, we get all of the things that we can style. Now, a panel container is super simple. Like the panel, we only have the panel option. And for that, I want to click on the plus, and now we can assign a custom style box. I want to go with style box flat. And if I do that, you can see, since the panel container is in the background, we are styling that one. If I click on it again, we can give it a custom color. The color I used in the final project is 171D25, which is a really dark blue grayish color. And well, with that, we are already getting something. I guess while we're here, we can also give it some corners. I have set all of those to 8. And we can give it a shadow, which I have set to 8 as well. And then reduced the opacity to 40. That way, if I go out of it, we get a shadow around it. And that really is the basic idea. You could keep on adding more UI elements and then style them, and all of those would be applied to the children of textbox. So I do want to be specific. We have applied a theme to the control node textbox, and the child of that is the panel container, which does not have any theme. It only gets a theme from its parent node. Also, this thing on the left here is a preview that is going to show you what the UI element is going to look like. Since there's no panel container in here, we are not going to get a preview. But what we can do is add a button, for which we are going to get a whole bunch of options. We can set the normal behavior of the button, the hover behavior of the button. We can change something if the button is pressed, and so on. To keep it simple, I want to have the normal button. If I click on the plus, we can add a style box flat. And now we are styling both buttons, and you also get more of a preview. In there, we are changing the button, the check button, and the other check button. I can also change the color to something like blue or really whatever color, and you are getting the preview. For this button, the color that I actually want to use is 252D38, which is a slightly lighter gray. After that, I want to set a corner radius of 3 pixels for every side. Then we have expand margins, where we can give them a few more margins. I'm going to go with 5 on every side for now. This will look weird for now, but we're going to fix that in just a bit. Finally, I want to add a shadow with a size of 2 and lower opacity. This should be 40. If I go out of it, we can see that the buttons are outside of the text box, which can happen very easily and something that we can fix using the margin container. For that, back in the text box, I want to add another node, which is going to be a margin container. This one doesn't really have that many options. We only have the margins for each side. And all of those you want to activate by clicking on the plus icon. And then I can give each side a margin of 10 pixels. And you have to select every single box manually. You can't simply tap. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. Bit annoying, but now this is looking much better. And once again, all of the styling is in this one theme file. Everything else inside of this text box doesn't have a theme applied to it, which keeps all of the info nice and central, which is quite nice to work with. One more thing that I want to work with, and that is a label. Since text can be customized quite a lot, we get a ton of options in here. The one that I want to work with is the font file. Click on plus, and now we can assign a font file to it. Speaking of, if you look at fonts in the file inspector, there we have loads of them. The one that I want to use is called Min Sans Regular. You can simply drag it in there or in the inspector, and then we get a slightly different font. Very hard to see, but if I increase the font size to 25, you can see that the text is definitely updating. Besides that, you can also change the font color. I want to have a slightly darker white. So there you can definitely see the text is changing. And I think you get the idea. All of those options are pretty straightforward, and you simply have to go through them one by one. There's one quick thing that I did forget inside of the button for the font. I also want to have a custom font, which should be Mint Sans. Looks a bit better, but now something that can happen quite easily is that the font isn't vertically centered properly. Meaning now we have a bit more space at the bottom compared to the top, which can look a bit strange. An easy way to fix that is inside of the style box for normal. You can expand the margins and then take away a few pixels at the top or at the bottom. In my case, I want to change the bottom to 2, and now this button looks much more centered. Also, I realized the corner radius has missed one corner, and that looks much better. Cool. So now our buttons look a bit nicer. This covers most of theming. There's one more topic that I do want to cover, and that is theme variations. If you click on this button, Manage Icons, you can see all of the UI nodes that are being customized. On top of that, you can add a new type to it. For example, in there, I want to add a blue button. If I now click on plus, we get another unmarked node, which is at the moment entirely empty. So this main box tells you which parts of the node can be customized. Inside of a panel container, we only get the panel. Inside of a label, we get loads more things. Inside of this blue button, at the moment, we can't do anything, meaning applying this theme to anything would be entirely pointless. There simply is nothing to customize. But what we can do on this right tab, we can set a base type. And in there, you can set a starting theme, which in my case should be button. If you now click on Set Base Type, we are getting all of the button attributes. And on top of that, if you click on Override All, we are applying the default button theme to it. That way, we're getting a default button. However, to apply it, we have to do something slightly weird. So let's say I want to apply this custom button theme to the OK button. For that, you want to click on the button, and in there, go to Theme, and then Theme Type Variation. And we are getting nothing. So nothing really happening here. To apply a custom theme, you have to click on this icon and then type the name of the theme, which in my case is blue button. If I now press enter, we get something very strange. The button starts to look super funky. That is because if I go to text box and, for example, to normal, there we have the style, and we have some weird BG color, and draw center is not enabled, so we're not drawing the center. But if I set all of those back to the defaults and remove the border, then we get the normal theming behavior. This would be the default button. This is also probably what you got by default. I don't know why Godot in my case does this weird theming behavior. But well, after you have that, you can set custom theme. For example, for the background, I want 3286 E3, which is a nice shade of blue. For the text color, or rather the font color, I want to have a white-ish color. Let's go with pure white. Besides that, for the corner radius, this should be 3 for every single side. We also want to expand the margins, like we have done with the other button, 5, 5, 5, and 2. And I want to give it a shadow. Let's go with 2 pixels and reduce the background opacity. Like so. And then we are slowly building up another kind of button. I guess another thing in here, we should use the same font that we have used for the other button. That looks much better. And with that, we get 2 different kinds of button, where we have a default button and a blue button. And you can apply them by simply going to the theme and then typing in the variation that you want to use. That way, we're getting the other kind of button. Or you can use the default flat button. Very easy to use. I guess the only annoying thing about it is that you have to type this thing in yourself. I have no idea why that needs to be the case, but it's just the way it is. Although there's one thing that you can do. If you go to Project and Project Settings and look for Theme, there under GUI you can find the theme, and you can set a custom theme for the entire project. If I load the theme that we have just created, custom theme, and open it, then we have to restart Godot. Let's do that really quick. Here we are again, and on the surface, not much has changed. However, now, if I have the button selected, and I go to Theme, Theme Variations, now we have the blue button and the flat button. And you can toggle between them super easily. Also, whenever I create a new layout node now, let's say a button, then this button will get the default theme that we have created earlier by default. If you look closely, you can see this button looks very different compared to a regular button. Literally every single UI node that we are going to add to this project will be themed by the custom theme that we have created. Especially for a larger project where you want to keep things consistent and organized, this can be incredibly powerful. Now, to practice all of this, let's do an exercise. On the screen right now, you can see a similar setup compared to what we had before, except with a different styling. Try to recreate all of this using the colors in the bottom. Also make sure that you are using a theme variation for the button, like we have done before. Pause the video now and see how far you get. First of all, back in Godot, we don't need this button anymore. And I also want to make sure inside of project settings, when we are looking for the theme, there shouldn't be a custom theme. This one should always be gone, and you might have to restart your Godot project. There we go. After that, inside of the text box, make sure that you don't have a custom theme. That way, we are back to the default. I want to apply a new theme and save it right away. So click on the arrow, save as, and then inside of the themes folder, I want to have an exercise theme. And now we can start customizing things. I guess we can start with buttons and then make sure that we are setting the normal. The color for this one is going to be E5, D3, C9, which is a fairly plain color. After that, I want to work on the border width. And for that, I only want to set a bottom border with 2 pixels. That way, we get this little bottom strip. On top of that, for the color, I basically want to copy the current color, so you can use the color picker, and then make it just a bit darker. Something like this. Finally, I want to set a corner radius of 6 pixels everywhere. And we can also expand the margins by the same amount. So 6, 6, 6, and 6. And there we go. Now we have a fairly nice looking button, although we do have to work on the text. For that, I want to work inside of the color tab and give it a font color. Click on plus. And the color I used was 776A8C, a purple-ishy color. That covers the basics of the buttons, so now we have something roughly okay looking. Although it doesn't fit in with the rest of the thing at all. So I guess we can start next up with the panel container for the main thing. In there, we want to have a new style box flat. The color for this one is going to be F5 EBE9. That looks significantly better. Next up, for the border width, like for the buttons, I only want to have a border at the bottom, and for this one, I want to have the same color as the background, and then make it ever so slightly darker. So if you zoom in, this is also going to be much more visible. They can see at the bottom, we have a slight border. After that, I want to have a corner radius of 10 pixels on every single side, and that looks kind of okay. The next thing that we really have to work on is going to be the margin container. So we make sure there's actual space between the buttons and the outline of the panel container. For this one, we simply have to set margins on every single side, like so. And I went with 12 pixels on every single side, which really helps. After that, I want to work on the label, for which I want to have, first of all, a custom font. So in the font tab, click on plus, and then inside of themes, fonts, we have a font called obsidianitalic.ttf. Drag this one in there. And now we have a different font, although very hard to see because the font color is very inappropriate. For that, we want to have a different font color, which I have set to 322B3D. A pretty dark color that works kind of well with the Godot logo. After that, we need a font size, which we can set inside of this tab. I went with 36. And that is a lot more readable. The last thing that we have to do is a font variation for the OK button. For this, I want to go to Manage Items and then add a green button. Click on plus, and now we have green button. That's all we need in here. Next up, inside of the type, select green button, and then select the base type. I want to go with button, and then overwrite all. Now we should have all of the button styling options, and we do. That looks pretty good. In my case, I only want to work with the style box for normal, and like before, in my case, Godot always does this default thing. No idea why, but very easily fixed. So with that, we have a default button style. This I want to apply to the button for OK right away. And for that, I want to go to theme, and in there, this shouldn't be blue button, this should be green button. And press enter, and now we are getting the default style for this button. That looks pretty good. Now we can start working on the style box to make it look nicer. First of all, for the color, this is indeed updating, so that's looking good. Perfect. The beachy color for this button should be 7ECC45. And after that, for the border width, I only want to have a bottom border with a size of 2 pixels. For the color for this one, once again, I want to get the main color of the button and then make it ever so slightly darker. Something like this. Looks about alright. Next up, corner radius. Like for the other button, this is all going to be 6 pixels. Same with expand margins, 6 pixels on every side. That is coming together quite nicely. Next up, I want to set the font color to a pure white color. On top of that, to make this button stand out a bit more, we can make the text a bit thicker by giving it an outline size of 1 pixel, maybe 2, and then change the color of the outline, which we can find under font outline color, this one. This should be the same color as the text. And then you make the font kind of bold, although you do have to be careful. This shouldn't be too thick. I guess 1 pixel is totally fine. And with that, we are pretty much done. With that, we have an entirely new theme that looks fairly alright. And best of all, you can switch between these themes super easily. If you want to go back to the original theme, our custom theme, you can simply drag it in there and then change the custom theme of this button to, I believe I called it blue button. And then we have the original back. So that is working really well. Perfect. That means the last thing that we have to work on is how to change themes using GDScript. For that one, you can take two paths. You can either work on an individual control node. For that one, you can either get the theme style box of a certain style, or you can change things like the font, and you would override the current theme. Besides that, you can also get the entire theme and then change things on there. For example, you could get the style box, set the font, or set a color, and so on. Back in Godot, I want to add a script to theme. All of the defaults here are totally fine, and click on Create. Once again, I don't need the process function, I only want to work inside of the ready function. And just to get started, I only want to work with the panel, the control node we worked with very early on. Which means, first of all, I want to target this inside of the ready function. And for this one, I want to get the theme style box. Godot wants to have a name and then a theme type, although this one has a default value, so we can ignore it. For the name, the only option we have is panel, so this is what I want to select. But you might be wondering, how do we get to this option? And well, for that, if you look at the panel, specifically at the style box flat that we have created, you can see inside of styles, we only have a single option, and this one is called panel. Inside of the theme property, you can see this one is called lowercase panel, and this is what we are targeting. An even easier way of understanding all of that is if you look at the theme that we have created earlier, which was inside of the text box. Here you can see all of the options, and if I look at a panel, let me add it really quick, panel. For a panel, we don't have very many options, but inside of this tab, we can see lowercase panel, which once again is the same thing that we are targeting in here. Or in other words, when Godot is looking for a name, it's looking for a style name. Now this would return a style box. Let's store it in a variable. Var style box is going to be whatever we are getting returned. I guess just to test that this is working, let's print the return value, style box, run the scene, and we are getting a style box flat inside of the output. That's a good sign. To make this a bit more explicit, you could also add s style box flat. Once you have that, you can target this style box and then, for example, change the background color, for which Godot has a separate color class, and in there, you can pick any color that you want. Let's go with brown. If I now run the scene again, the center of the panel is going to be brown, or whatever color you specified. If I change this to something like dark slate gray, then the panel is going to look a bit different. Perfect. Besides that, you could also get this style box again, and then set the corner radius bottom right to a value of 0. If I do that, then the bottom corner is going to be very sharp. And that's really all you need for a basic style box. If you want to find all of the options, simply go to one of the style boxes and hover over the option that you are looking for, like BG color, or the one that we have used is bottom right. Via that, you could get a style box and change it. And that is literally all you can really do with a panel. Next up, we have a label. And a label has different kinds of style options. If you look at the theme overrides, we have, for example, colors, constants, fonts, and quite a few more options. Now for this one, we could still use a style box. This one would be called normal. You can see in there, we have a style box flat. But for example, for font, this would not work because a font is not a style box. I think that part is quite obvious. So instead, let me target the label inside of the ready function. To change, for example, the font, you want to add a theme, and then you get lots of suggestions, like add theme color override, constant override, font override, I want to go with a font override. In there, once again, Godot is asking for a name. We only have one option here, and that is font. After that, for the second option, Godot wants to have the actual font that we want to use. And for that, inside of fonts, we have a whole bunch of files that we could be using. I do want to reuse those later on as well. So let me create onReady var fonts, which is going to be a list where we are preloading all of the fonts. I want to have Lockernome, simply drag it in there. Besides that, I want to preload Obsidian Italic, this one. And finally, I want to preload Papercuts 2, this one here. That way, we have a list with 3 fonts, and I want to use the first one for now. I want to target fonts, and then get fonts and 0. Let's try all of this again, and now the font is going to look very different. If you look at the inspector for the label, you can see under fonts, we only have one option, and that is called font, which is what we are targeting with this string. As a second argument, we have to get a font that we are preloading. Besides that, what you could also do, if I expand this thing a bit, under font sizes, we have the font size, which is called font size. And this one you can target with the label again, and you want to add theme font size override. For this, once again, we only have one option, font size, and the second argument is going to be the actual size as an integer. Let's go with 40 to have something really large. And there we go. Now we have a much bigger label. And with that, you could override any kind of value inside of a control node. That's the first way to approach it. The second way would be to get a theme itself and then change the attributes of the theme via GDScript. The way you would approach that is, first of all, you have to get the theme itself. I think the easiest way of doing that is to preload it once the scene is ready, which means on ready var, let's call it the text box theme. And this we can get via preload. And then I want to drag in the custom theme that we are currently using. And let me add a bit more space so we can actually see what's going on. I think that's a good bit better. So basically, now we have a text box theme, and this we can work with. For example, what we could be doing is to use the text box theme and then get a style box list for one kind of node. For example, a button. And all of this we want to print to see what we are getting. Let's try this one now. And there you can see inside of a button, we only have a single style box flat. Or in other words, if I look at the custom theme we have created, specifically the button, the only custom style box that we have used is the one for normal. And this is what we are seeing inside of this list. Now we do have other style box flats, but those are the default values, so they don't show up in there. That's one way to see what you have, but to change it, you want to get a specific style box. And that you can get by assigning it to a variable. Let's call it the normal underscore style box. I want to get the text box theme and then get the style box. Godot wants to have 2 values. The first one is the name and then the theme type. Name is what we have seen earlier, so the specific style that we are looking for. In our case, this is normal. After that, Godot is looking for a theme type. This would be the kind of node that you're working with. For example, in my case, that would be the button. The return value is going to be a style box flat. Let's be a bit more specific. So I want to have a style box flat. And then for the normal style box, we can, for example, change the BG color to a color value. Let's go with red. And after that, I can run the scene, and the cancel button is going to be red. What you can also do is get the text box theme and then set a color, for which we need a name, which in our case is going to be the font underscore color. Then we need a theme type, which is going to be button. And finally, we need a color. Let's go with color.yellow. Once we have that, I can run the entire thing, and now the button text color is going to be yellow. And well, with all of that, I think you get the idea. You either get a style box from a theme and then change that style box, or you take the theme and then set values directly. If you look at the documentation, you can find a whole bunch of options. There aren't that many options to work with, and they're all very accessible. That means, finally, the last thing for this part is going to be a very basic animation, which is going to be an exercise. I want you guys to animate the theme so that by the end of it, it looks like this. Every 0.5 seconds, change the BG color, font color, outline color, and the button margins of the cancel button. Pause the video now and see how far you get. Effectively, what I want to do is, let me minimize the text box, and then I want to add a timer to the scene, which we can rename to button style timer. I want to set a wait time of half a second, and it should auto start, but it should not one shot. After that, I want to get the timeout signal and connect it to the script. Once we have that, we can run a script every half second. In there, first of all, I want to get a random font color that I want to store in a variable, and the values here are simply going to be a list with color.red. And let me actually copy the other values and paste them in like so. All we are getting in here is color red, color hot pink, color aqua, and color lime. From this list, we want to pick a random value, which we can do via pick random. This color I then want to use for the font color of the normal button. This we have already seen. I want to have a text box theme and then set color. For the values, we can simply copy what we have done earlier and paste it in there. I want to get the font color of the button. The only change that we have to make is I don't want to set this to color yellow. Instead, I want to get the font color. If I run all of this, we are getting a random text color. That looks pretty good. Besides that, I also want to get the text box theme again and then set a font. For the name, I want to have the font. The theme type is going to be button. And for the font, I want to get one of these fonts at random, which means fonts.pick random. Let's try all of this. And we are getting a random font along with a random color. Perfect. This would cover the font. After that, I want to add the font outline. To target this one, you have to get the text box theme and then set a constant. For that, we want to get the outline underscore size. Next up, we need the theme type, which once again is going to be button. And then we have to set a value, which I want to set to 30. What this is giving us is a pretty massive outline around the font. Next up, I want to get the text box theme again and then set a color, which is called font outline underscore color. As always, we are working inside of a button, and then we need a random color. This is going to work very similar compared to what we have seen up here. In fact, I want to copy the entire thing and then paste it in there. That way, we're getting a random color. I guess you could be adding a few more colors in here to make this more random. But for our purposes, we are now getting an outline along with a random color. Finally, I want to change the button BG and margin. All of these options are inside of the button style box, which we currently don't have available. Now, getting this value every single time the timer triggers would be possible, but not really elegant. I think the much better option would be to get it once the scene is ready and then reuse it. Which means on ready var, let's call it the button underscore style box. And this we get from the text box theme get underscore style box. Pretty much what we have done down here, to be honest. In fact, I can copy all of these values, paste them in there, and we should be good to go. After that, inside of the timer function, I want to get the button style box and then set the BG color with a random color. So redo what we have done up there. Let's see if this is working, and we should be getting random colors. That looks pretty solid. Besides that, the style box can also expand margin on all of the sides. For each of the side, I want to have a random value, and let's start with the bottom one. Now, to get a random value, we have to create a random number generator. This happens all the way at the top. Var RNG going to be a random number generator dot new. And after that, we can call RNG rand I range. I want to have a value between 5 and 20. With that, we should be changing the size of the button every time the timer triggers, and that looks pretty good. This we now want to duplicate 3 more times, and then change it to all of the sides. So we have left, we have top, and we have right. Always with the same values, it doesn't really matter. Just choose whatever you like in here, but we are getting very random values. Cool, that is working really well. And that is pretty much it. At this point, you can either target the theme via GDScript of a single control node, or you can change the theme itself. Both would work, really depending on what your specific needs are. So at this point, we know about basically all UI nodes, and we can theme them. That means next up, we have to work on the control of them a bit more. Specifically, that means we want to capture controller and keyboard input. Now, the end result for all of this isn't going to be too impressive, but well, it's super important to capture input other than the mouse. So let's talk about it. Layouts and controllers, and this would also work for the keyboard. So far, we only used mouse input, which is super easy. You just click on a button and then the button is being pressed. However, for most games, you don't have a mouse available and the game is designed entirely around controllers. For that, Godot has a concept called focus. Basically what that means is that interactive control elements like buttons and sliders and anything that you can interact with can be focused. Once one of these elements is focused, it means they are selected. So if you press a button, you will trigger them. And this button can be customized. Also, if you press up, down, left, or right, Godot will look for other control nodes that can be focused, and it will then focus those. That way, you can select different UI elements. For all of that, back in Godot, I want to go to folder 4, interactions, and in there we have keyboard control, which contains already a couple of elements. Nothing too complicated in here. We have a VBox container with a whole bunch of buttons. We have a grid container with even more buttons. We have an individual button, and we have an H slider. And that's just about it. There's no code attached to any of this, although we do have a theme attached to keyboard control. If you look at the inspector under theme, we have a theme, and we only have one element that we are theming, the button. In there, the only element that we are looking at is called focus. And let me maximize all of this. Inside of this tab, you can see all of the states that the button can have. We have already seen normal a couple of times, and then you have the obvious ones, like how the button should look if it's pressed, if you're hovering over it, and then if you want to mirror things, but those aren't too important. There's also disabled, and I think that one is fairly obvious. Focus is what you're getting when the button is focused. And in our case, the styling for that is simply an orangey color. We don't do any other styling, so if the button is focused, it's going to be orange. With that, let me run the scene. And by default, not a single button is focused. I can hover over them and we get different styling, but that doesn't really do anything. However, if I now click on a button with my mouse, after we are pressing it, it becomes orange or yellow, whatever this color is. That means this button is now focused. And what is really cool about that is if on the keyboard I press down, we are focusing another button. And if I go right, we're getting another button, and then we can go around and select other things. Also, from this button, if I go down, we have the slider selected. If I now press right, then we are moving the slider around. If I press up again, we're going back to the buttons. Also, if you're on a button and you press enter, then you would be pressing the button, for which we don't have code right now, but it would work. And that is the basic idea of focusing elements inside of Godot. And I guess while we are here, let's get this first button and attach a pressed signal to it. For that, first of all, inside of keyboard control, I want to attach a script. All of the defaults here are fine, although we don't need any of the functions. Instead, I want to get the first button and then connect the pressed signal. On button pressed, and if that is the case, I want to print button was pressed. If I now run this scene again, I can click on button 1, and we're getting button was pressed. On top of that, this button is now selected. And if I press enter, we're getting button was pressed again. This works only for this button, so if I go down to button 2, we don't get any kind of signal. For the obvious reasons, we didn't connect a signal yet. Now, there are a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. Most importantly, when you go to project settings, and then to the input map. For this project, we already have a whole bunch of actions that we have defined. That way, we can capture controller input in just a bit. But on top of that, in the top right, we have show built-in actions. If you activate that one, and let me expand this window, you can see a whole lot more actions, and those are important. For example, UI accept lets you define which button on your keyboard or on your controller activates a button. I think by default, you only get enter, key P enter, and space. But on top of that, you can add joypad button 0 to it as well. This is a custom thing that I have added myself. All of these actions work like the ones you can add yourself, meaning you can remove or add things as you please. And the really important ones in there are UI accept, UI cancel, and then we have UI left, UI right, UI up, and UI down. To all of those, I added the joypad, so we can use those to select different elements as well. I want to run the entire thing again, and then get one button focused. After that, I am not going to touch my keyboard or my mouse. Instead, I am only going to use a controller. And on this one, I can go up and down and still select different buttons just as before. But this only works because I defined custom actions inside of the input map. So for example, we can only focus another button to the left because of this custom action here. Same with right, up, and down. All of those are custom actions that I have added. If you want to use controller input, you have to add a couple of options to the built-in actions, depending on what you need. Besides that, if you select any of these buttons and you look at the inspector, you can see we have a focus option. In there, we can define what the right neighbor is going to be. By default, all of these are empty, and Godot is simply going to look what element would be closest to the right or closest to the top, and so on. But sometimes that's not exactly what you want. For example, if you have any of these buttons focused and you're going to the right, by default, you would end up on this button. But that might not be what you want. Maybe you want to go straight to all of these buttons on the right. For that, you could simply define the neighbor to the right for all of these buttons. Let's do it only for button 1. I want to get neighbor right, then assign one of the other buttons. In our case, this is going to be the first button in the grid container. If I add this one and run the entire thing again, if I have button 1 focused and go to the right, we are going straight to the buttons inside of the grid. But from button 2, if I go to the right, we are going to the individual button. There are a few more options that you could be working with in here, but I think they're all fairly straightforward. Besides that, you also have mouse, and there you can, for example, filter different actions. But I don't think those are too important. Instead, what I want to talk about is how to work with all of this using GDScript. For that, we already have a script, and this I want to open. For now, I simply want to add a func_ready. The first thing that you basically always want to do is focus one of these buttons, because at the moment, if I run the scene, we don't have any control element focused. If I press anything on my controller or my keyboard, nothing is going to happen, because we always have to start from some point. And well, for that, you want to get one of the nodes, the one that you want to start with. In my case, this is going to be the first button inside of the VBox container, which means I want to get the VBox container and then the first button. This button is going to have a method called grabFocus. Once you're doing that, you can run the entire thing again, and now we have this one button focused, which means I can use keyboard input and we can do all the stuff we have done before. Perfect. Now, besides that, what you can also do is implement some kind of custom system for controlling the focus. For example, for the first 4 buttons, if I go to the bottom and press further down, I want to end up at the top again. And this doesn't work by default, but we can implement a custom system. First of all, I want to create a variable called index, which has to be an integer with a default value of 0. Which you don't have to add. If you simply specify an integer, you're getting 0. After that, I want to get func and check whenever we have an input event. In there, I want to capture the up and down button. And those we're getting from project settings. I don't care about the built-in actions. Instead, I have defined 2 custom actions, up and down, which are either W and S on the keyboard, or if you have a controller, they would be the left joypad up and down. Those I want to check first of all and store the return value inside of a variable. Let's call it dir. This we get via input and get_axes. For this, we need a negative and a positive action. The negative one is going to be up and the positive one is going to be down. To see the end result, let's print direction. And if I now run the scene and I press W or S on the keyboard, we're getting -1 or +1. And same on the controller, we're getting the same output. After we have that, I want to check if the value of direction is different from 0. Then I want to update the index that we have just created. The value for this one is going to be the current value of the index plus the integer value of direction. And after that, I want to get mod and then the VBox container.getChildCount. Via this mod, we always keep the index inside of the range, the number of buttons. We get button 0, 1, 2, and 3. And this value by itself, without the mod, could get as large or as low as it wants to be. But because of the mod, if it exceeds value 3, we're going back to 0. That way, we are toggling between them at all times. Once we have all of that, I simply want to get the VBox container again, get a child via the index, and then grab the focus of that node. And with that, we should be good to go. If I now run the scene again, I can press S, we're going down, and once we reach button 4, if I go further down, we go back to button 1. This also works the other way, so this system is pretty straightforward. Now, really important, if you use the arrow keys on the keyboard, this is not going to work, because those use the inbuilt Godot system, which doesn't let you go back to the start. Only if you use WASD, then you get the system where you jump back to the start. If you wanted to have more consistency for all of that, you could simply add WASD to the inbuilt actions, and that way you would override the inbuilt movement system with the custom built one that we have just created. Other than that, this is pretty much it when it comes to focus. The system is really straightforward. Meaning this covers another really important part of layouts. Time for the first real project. We are going to recreate the Zelda Breath of the Wild UI. This is also somewhat interactive. When you are healing, you get more hearts, and when you get hurt, you are losing hearts. On top of that, if you press down on the D-pad, you can select different actions, although this is just a picture, it doesn't actually do anything. Speaking of not doing anything, all of the other icons also don't do anything. They're just there to illustrate how you place the elements. If you wanted to make them interactive, you would have to add a bit more code. But I think at this point, you could create that system on your own, so I want to focus on the bare bones. That being said though, all of this can be an exercise right away. I want you guys to recreate this entire layout along with some very basic styling to make it look good. Although first of all, for all of that, here we are back in Godot, and I want to go to folder 5, Breath of the Wild, HUD. And there we already have a whole bunch of stuff that we don't really have to worry about. You simply have to go to main.tscn, open that one, and then go to the 3D view. There you can see we already have a pretty decent 3D game open. If you run all of that, you get a basic game where you can jump, you can walk around, and we have a few more elements, although none of those matter. Instead, what I want to focus on are the two buttons in the top left. We have Heal VFX and Hit VFX. If you click on either of those, we either get a heal effect or a hit effect. Those can also be triggered via a controller. If you press Y or B, then you get the same effect. Now, for this tutorial, I am not going to focus on 3D stuff at all. If you care about that, check out my dedicated tutorial on 3D games in Godot. This topic gets a bit more complex, so I don't have time for it at this point. I simply want to focus on the UI for this game. At the moment, we actually already have a couple of very basic UI elements. We have an HBox container that is glued to the top right of the window, and in there we have a heal button and a hit button. On top of that, we have inside of main a bit of code where we are getting the buttons and we are connecting a signal to it. That signal covers a bit of logic that we are going to ignore. On top of that, we are checking for the input, we are checking for a heal action or hurt action, and then we are calling the same function. That way, we're getting all of the functionality and we can focus entirely on the UI. Which means what I want to do is create another scene, which is going to be a user interface. This I want to rename right away to HUD, save it inside of folder 5, Breath of the Wild HUD, and then HUD.tscn. Inside of this scene, we are going to add all of the UI elements. I guess for now, just so we have something, let me add a color rectangle that we are going to drag somewhere into the middle, save it, and then inside of main, all the way at the bottom, I want to add the HUD scene that we have just created. If I do that and run the game again, we are getting that rectangle in the middle of the window, and if we run around, it stays in the same position, which should give you a pretty good start to recreate the UI. Effectively, you want to remove this color rectangle and instead add all of the other elements. And for that, inside of the file system, we have UI graphics, and there you have all of the elements that you are going to need. So pause the video now and try to recreate the UI you see on the screen right now. Bonus points if you can make all of this interactive. First of all, I want to work on the hearts. For that, to the HUD, I want to add an HFlow container. The layout for this one is going to be anchor based, and I want to have a custom value system. We don't need any of the offsets, at least for now. Instead, I want to work with the anchor points. Left and top can stay at 0 and 0, but the right side I want to have at 0.3, and the bottom should be 0.15. That way, we are covering the top left-ish area. On top of that, I want to have a bit of an offset to the top and to the left. For that, we can use the anchor offsets. For left and top, I want to have 15 pixels. And that way, we are in the top left with a bit of padding around it. Now to this HFlow container, I want to add a texture rectangle with heart.png that we can simply drag in there. Now this heart is going to be way too big. If I run all of this, you can see that this is ever so slightly too large. That is because this rectangle at the moment keeps the size of the original graphic. To fix that, first of all, for the scale mode, I want to keep the aspect ratio, and for the size, I want to fit with proportional. Once we're doing that, the heart disappears entirely. To fix that, I want to give it a custom minimum size of 20 and 20 pixels. That way, it's going to reappear in a much more reasonable size. That's pretty good. And on top of that, if I duplicate this heart a whole bunch of times, at some point, we are getting to the next column, which, if I run the rest of the game, is going to look pretty Zelda-y. That is working quite well. On top of that, if you wanted to, in the HFlow container, we don't need the layout right now, but inside of theme overrides, you could add a bit more H and V separation, depending on what you like, but I think the default style here works pretty well. And alright, with that, we have the first item covered. I guess looking at this, we can make this container a bit less tall. So inside of layout, the bottom could be 0.1. That feels a bit cleaner. Cool, that covers the hearts for now, meaning I can rename the HFlow container to hearts to keep everything just a bit more organized. After that, I want to add the equipment, which is going to be a VBox container. Let me change the name, equipment. Just as before, for the layout, I want to use anchors and custom values. For the anchor points, left can be 0, top should be 0.1, that looks about right. Right is going to be 0.1, and the bottom is going to be 0.3. That covers roughly the right area. On top of that, for the offsets, I don't want to right or bottom values, but I do want to have padding to the left, which means left is going to get 15 pixels. Ideally here, you want to get the same values that you have used for the hearts. So those two are aligned, which I think looks good, but if you don't like it, choose whatever you like. Now with that, we can arrange items on the vertical axes. And we have to create some kind of cross system, where we have the first item in the middle, then we get 3 items, and then we have 1 item at the bottom. For that, I have simply created 3 HBox containers. Let me add them, HBox container, and those are supposed to expand. If I then add 3 of them, we get 3 equally spaced items. For the first one, I simply want to add a texture rectangle with, I think I used the cloud.png image, which by default, once again, is going to be way too large. To make this a bit better, I want to fit the width, and then for scaling, keep aspect centered. If you now select the HBox container, you can see we are fitting this thing perfectly in there. On top of that, for the alignment for the first HBox container, it should be center. That way, this thing is right in the middle. That system we can then reuse for HBox container 2. In there, I want to have 3 texture rectangles. Although let me start with the first one. In there, I want to have the sword that is also somewhere in there. There we go. We have sword.png, and this I want to drag into the texture. Once again, same problem. This is way too large. Fix that with fit width and keep aspect centered. That looks much better. This I then want to duplicate 2 times. For the second texture rectangle, I want to get cross.png, drag it in there. And for the final one, I want to get the shield, like so. And with that, we have basically created a grid. Although I think for all of that, we want to center things as well, just to make sure that those 2 HBox containers are doing the same thing. But if you look at it, we now have a grid where the top left and top right are empty, but the other elements are aligned perfectly well. Let's try that in a game. And that looks pretty good. Cool. Finally, for the bottom one, we pretty much want to copy what we have done in the first one, which means I can duplicate the texture rectangle and drag it into the third HBox container. For this HBox container, we have to set the alignment to center. and then change the actual image that we want to use. I went with the potion. So with that, we have a perfect cross. That's a good start, but not exactly what we want yet. There should be a bit of space between the cross and the potion. For that, I want to add one more node, which is just going to be a control node that I want to add right below HBox container. Effectively, this control node is just going to be a spacer, or let's call it a V spacer. Its only purpose is to add a bit of space between these other elements. I want to go to layout and give it a custom minimum Y size, let's say 20. And with that, we have a bit of vertical space. Let's try that in the game, and I think that looks all right. With that, we have the top left part. That means finally, we have to cover the bottom right. This is going to be an HBox container that I have named info. For this one, just as before, for layout, I want to have anchors and get custom ones. Then we have to work with the anchor points and the anchor offsets for now. Left should be 0.8 and the top should be 0.8 as well. Right and bottom should both be 1. Then for the right and the bottom, for some padding, I want to have -15 for both. And that looks like a decent-ish area to work with. The first item to add in there is going to be super simple. I simply want to add a texture rectangle, which we can get from UI graphics. There we have map.png. Drag it in there. And make sure you set it to fit height and then keep aspect centered. This is not going to do anything at the moment because we don't have horizontal space. For that, you want to expand the horizontal alignment, and then we are getting something. This is still much too large because we have to add the other element as well. Although I guess for now, we can change fit height to fit width, and that way we don't exceed the vertical amount of space. That would be the first part. Next up, we have to add all of the icons, and this has to happen before the texture rectangle, so we are on the left side of it. For that, I have added a VBox container. That once again has to come before the texture rectangle. This one I also want to set to expand being true. That way we are separating this space into 2 parts. After that, I want to add a texture rectangle once again, and then add radar.png to it. This is going to look horrible. To fix it, fit width, and for scaling, keep aspect centered. Also, I want to set vertical alignment to expand. With that, we are filling in the entire vertical space, which is a good start because if we copy it, we are only filling in half of it. The second icon that I want to use is going to be temperature.png or temp.png. That also works. Next up, we have to get these icons to the right side. And for that, you want to go to texture rectangle, and then for the horizontal alignment, click on this icon. That way, we are on the right. You can also center it or go to the left side or get the entire space, but I only want to go to the right side. The same for the second one. We only want to go to the right side. After that, we have to add 2 things, the text and another icon. For that, I am going to add another HBox container that is supposed to expand. This one will contain 2 items, a label and a texture rectangle. The texture rectangle is going to be sound.png. This label is supposed to show the current time, let's say 11 AM for now. And after that, this icon should be as large as the other 2. The easiest way of doing that is to use the same things we have used earlier, so keep aspect centered and fit width. That way, they are the same size. That looks about alright. Next up, we have to get this icon to the right, for which we cannot use shrink end at the moment. Instead, I think the easiest way of doing that is to add a control node between the 2 and set this control node to expand. That way, we are filling up any space between these 2 nodes. and that is going to move the texture rectangle all the way to the right. And that is coming together quite nicely. Finally, to the VBox container, I want to add one more thing, and that is going to be the panel container. The only thing the panel here is going to do is add a bit of background. As a child to it, I want to add a margin container, and to this margin container, I want to add an HBox container, which in turn is going to contain 3 texture rectangles. 1, 2, and 3. That makes this UI already a bit more complex, but we're slowly getting there. First of all, the panel container should be set to expand. That way, we are getting a bit of vertical space. That's a good sign. And then for the texture rectangles, I want to add the sun to it. And I guess for the second texture rectangle as well, we can have the sun. And for the third one, just for something different, I want to add this snowflake. And that is going to break the UI quite badly. To fix all of that, you want to set the expand mode and the stretch mode all to fit with and keep aspect centered. There we go. This is much better. After that, via the margin container, I want to go to theme overrides and then give it a margin on every single side of 5 pixels. The last thing that I want to do is for the texture rectangle, set all of them to expand so they take up as much space as they can. And that way, we are centering the elements quite nicely. Cool, that looks all right. Another thing that you could be doing at this point, if you go to any of the texture rectangles, you can go to visibility and then modulate and reduce the alpha value. Let's say 100. That way, the white color is a bit less pronounced, but this is fairly subjective. Let me just do it for all of them, so it's a bit more consistent. I think that looks a bit nicer. Anyway, the last thing that we have to do for the panel container is go to theme overrides and then add a style box flat for the panel. The color I went with is 121212, which is a very, very dark gray. And then for the corner radius, I have set all of these values to 15. That way, we are getting rounded corners, which is looking quite nice. And with that, we have the entirety of the UI, although it's entirely static, but that we can still work with. If I run the game, this is looking pretty good. That means now we just have to make all of this interactive. And by interactive, I mean if the player presses down on the D-pad, we are changing this icon, and if we are adding or removing health, then the hearts display the current health amount. That's pretty much it. And all of this we want to control from inside of the player, which already has a couple of lines of code. Let me expand this. So in there, we have a bunch of things, but we're going to ignore all of them. We're not going to work with either of these functions. We're going to create our own. And I guess, first of all, I'm going to create a function for underscore input, where we are checking for an event, although we don't care about that. And instead, I simply want to check if input is action pressed, with the action I'm looking for being menu down. This is a custom action that I have to find inside of project settings, the input map. Somewhere in there, we have menu down. There's only one action for it, which is joypad 12 or D-pad down. If you only have a keyboard available, you will want to add an extra action in here for some kind of keyboard button, but I am not going to worry about that. If the player is pressing that button, we want to change the HUD. Ideally, I want to do something like HUD and then change underscore item. For that, first of all, we have to get the HUD. And the easiest way of doing that is to put this node inside of a group. Let's add one, name HUD is totally fine. And once we get that, all the way at the top, let me add a bit of space in here. I want to on ready var HUD is going to be get underscore tree and get first node in group hut. That way, all of this is going to work. We simply have to add a script to our hut and then get rid of the default functions and instead create func change underscore item. Just to test if this is working, I want to print change item. That means we can run the main scene. If I press down on the D-pad, we're getting change item, which means we can work more inside of hut.gd. First of all, we need a bunch of icons that we want to go through. All of those I have stored inside of a dictionary, which I'm getting with onReady var item dictionary, which is going to be a dictionary where the key is going to be the index. We're starting with 1, and I want to reload potion.png. I want to have 1, which is also going to reload another graphic. For this one, I want to have shuriken.png. Finally, the index is going to be 2, for which we want to preload thunder.png. This would be the graphics that we want to display, and every time we are calling this function, we want to go through these values. And for that, we can use a system very similar compared to what we have done in the last part. Or in other words, I want to create a variable, let's call it item index, which has to be an integer. After that, instead of printing a value, I want to update the item, not dictionary, but rather index. The value we are going to assign to it is going to be the pos mod. So we're using the mod function, but we are only getting the positive values. For this, we want to have 2 arguments. First one is going to be the current value of the item index, but plus 1. And then for the other value, we want to get item dictionary and the size of it. That way, this item index is always going to stay within the range of these values. That means once we have that, we simply want to get from the hut this icon here, which is the texture rectangle inside of hbox container 3. I guess a good way of working with that would be, before we're doing anything, onReady var item underscore slot, and then get the texture rectangle by simply dragging it in there. Once we have that, I simply want to get the item slot and update the texture. The value we want to assign to it is going to be the item dictionary and then indexing with the item underscore index. And that should be it. If I now go to main, run the scene, and I press down on the D-pad, we are toggling through these items. And the logic for all of this is also really straightforward, or at least I hope it is. Next up, we have to implement the heart mechanic. For that, if you look at player.gd, we already have a variable that tracks the current health, and inside of main.py, when the player gets hit, we are reducing that value, and when the player gets healed, we are increasing that value. And by the way, to get the player, we are simply getting the player all the way up here. All that we have to do is whenever the player health changes, then we want to run some code, which we can do very easily via set and value. Every time the value of health changes, we are calling this function. First of all, in there, we want to update the current health value with the value that we are getting. On top of that, I want to get the hut and then set hearts with the current amount of health. This set hearts function doesn't exist yet, which means inside of hut, set hearts, and then get some kind of value, which always has to be an integer. Now we have to figure out how to update the amount of hearts that we actually want to use. And basically the way we are going to approach that is, at the moment, we are storing all of the hearts inside of the hearts container. This one, if you toggle it, you can see all of the hearts are in there. And what I want to do is every time we are calling this function, we're getting rid of all of the texture rectangles in there, so it's going to be empty. And then we are going to add new hearts to it, depending on what this value is. First of all, I want to do for heart in the hearts container, and then get children. I simply want to get rid of all of them, which means heart.q3. That way, if we are running the main scene and we are changing the health, then the hearts are going to disappear, which is the expected behavior. So that's a good sign. Next up, we have to create new hearts depending on what this value is. And for that, I want to create a new scene, which can be a user interface, and rename it to heart. To this heart, I want to add a single texture rectangle, which is going to be a heart. So let me add it in there. I want to add a heart to the texture. For the control scene, I want to set a custom minimum size of 20 and 20. The same thing we have done for the hearts inside of the heart scene. So in there, we have 20 and 20. You want to have the same values in there. All of this I want to save inside of folder 5, heart.tscn. Besides that, for the heart, I want to fit the width and then keep aspect centered. That is going to give us a single heart. And that we want to use inside of hut.gd. First of all, we have to preload the scene. This can be a constant. I simply want to get the heart scene. I want to preload 5 Breath of the Wild hut heart.tscn. Make sure you don't get heart.png. That would be the wrong one. We want to have the scene, not the graphic. Important difference. And after that, inside of set hearts, I want for I in the value that we are getting from the parameters, and then create one instance of the heart scene, which means heart scene.instantiate. This heart we then want to add to the hearts container, which means hearts, add the child to it, and then the heart. That way, we're adding the right amount of hearts depending on what the value is. Let's try all of that. If I now run this again, we are starting with a lot of hearts, but if I reduce the amount, we are getting more hearts, and we can remove them as well. So that is working. We just have to figure out the size of the hearts. That one looks a bit weird. All we have to do for that, inside of the heart scene, first of all, the heart shouldn't cover the entire full rectangle. It can simply be in the top left. And after that, for the texture rectangle, I want to cover the entire available space. That way, we are filling the entire available size. That looks much better. If I now try this again, we have a whole bunch of hearts, and if I heal or get hurt, we are getting the right sized hearts. That looks much better. The only thing we have to do now, once the player scene is ready, let me go to it, player. I want to set the current right amount of health right at the beginning. For that, all we have to do is get func_ready, get the hut, and then set the hearts. The same function we have used up here. As an argument in there, I want to add the current amount of health. That way, if I run the entire thing, right at the beginning, we're getting 3 hearts, and I can add some to it or remove them. And all of this is working really well. If I add more hearts at some point, we are getting to the next line. There we go. And this is working quite well. And well, with that, we have a really nice looking UI that is also somewhat interactive. Still not perfect, and you would want to add a lot more to it, like make all of this interactive, make all of this interactive, but I think you get the idea. In this part, we are going to create speech bubbles for a 2D game. Or in other words, we are going to add control nodes to a 2D scene, which is fairly straightforward because layouts and 2D scenes work really well together. There aren't that many things that you have to worry about, so with a few minor adjustments, you can basically treat a control node like a node 2D. On top of that, via a canvas layer, you can stick any control node straight to the camera, which is really nice if you want to create a HUD like we have done in the last part. And for all of that, here we are back in Godot. I want to go to folder 6, dialog. In there, we have a couple of things, a font, a texture, and a folder with a game. That we're going to look at in a second. First of all though, I want to look at 9-patch rects in a bit more detail. And for that, I want to create a new user interface scene. Let's call this one 9-patch. And as a reminder, earlier we looked at 9-patch rectangles very briefly, but I think I should go into a bit more detail. Because a 9-patch rectangle, if you want to create speech bubbles, is essential. What does this one do? Well, if you look at the inspector, we get a whole bunch of options, and first of all, we have to add a texture. And for that, we have this 9-patch texture that I want to add in there. If I do that, we can see the texture. That's a good start. Now, the first issue is that this thing is really blurry. This does not look good. To fix that, you want to go to texture, and there under filter, you want to go to nearest. That way, pixel art is going to look significantly better. That gives us a texture which looks much better, but the issue that we have now is if I resize this thing, it is going to look really weird because the pixels get very different sizes. And this I ideally want to avoid, which is the exact purpose of a 9-patch rectangle. All that this node does is it separates a texture into 9 parts. Meaning we have 1, 2, 3, all the way down to 9. Once it has that information, it keeps all of the corners constant, meaning those bits here do not change. And on top of that, the bits connecting them are either going to be scaled or tiled, meaning if you make it twice as long, you simply get more of these bits. The same, by the way, happens to the inner bit. This one simply gets tiled, although most of the time this is an empty space, so it doesn't really matter what happens to it. Anyway, I think that's still kind of confusing, so let's do this in practice. For this thing, we have to assign a patch margin. And for that, for example, if I set the left side to 12, then you can already see that the left side is much more pixel perfect. Same if I do to the top, if I add a 12 in here. Now, in the top left, we have a perfect corner, and the top part simply gets stretched out or tiled, depending on what you define inside of axis stretch. At the moment, we have set this to stretch, so this area is going to be stretched if we add more space to it. And I think you can see it fairly well. If I set this to tiled, then we get a, well, very strange effect that we can work on in just a bit. For now, let's go with stretch. For all of the sides, you want to set the same patch margin. That way, if you resize this thing, you always have perfect corners, and the edges also look really nice and sharp. For any speech bubble, this is what you will always need. Also, if you go to Edit Region, you can see a bit more visually what Godot is doing. And with that, we have a 9-patch rectangle. That's really what it does, and this is super useful. On top of that, sometimes you want to have a button, let me add one, that does the same thing. I suppose we can call this button, and then move it a bit further to the right, like so. Now for this button, I always want to use pixel art, and I want to make sure that we get a similar effect compared to the 9-patch rectangle. For that, you want to go to either theme or theme override, and then set the styles. I'm going to work with normal, because that's the one that we can see the easiest. And in there, you want to add a style box texture. If you do that, you can add a texture to it, and I want to use the 9-patch texture, like so. And just as before, the default scaling here is super bad. To fix that, you want to go to texture, and like before, set filter to nearest, which is going to make the text look a bit weird, but we can work on that. After that, for this button, we can set texture margins, which do the same thing that we have seen in the 9-patch rectangle. These patch margins are effectively the same that we can see down here, meaning if I set them all to a value of 12, then we have a really nice pixel art button And most importantly, if we are resizing it, we keep the really nice corners and edges. That way, you can create a pixel art button that you can scale to any size. And I guess while we are here, we can also update the font and drag in public pixel art in there, which makes all of this look a bit nicer. And with that, we have 9 patch rectangles. Let's save the entire scene before we are losing it. 9patch.tsn is totally fine. And that is a pretty good start. Next up then, we can work on the dialogue game. In there, we have a graphics folder, a player folder, and a game folder. If you open the game folder and you zoom out a bit, you can see that we already have a couple of very basic things. Most of the stuff in here isn't interactive. We have simply a couple of houses, which are a static body 2D, along with a sprite 2D. We also have a background for the world, and this I've taken from another game of mine. The water bits are missing, but don't worry about that. It's really not important. Besides that, we have one interactive element, and that is the player itself, which is an animated sprite 2D, a collision shape, and a camera. If you look at the code, let me expand all of this. We are effectively getting a direction, and from that, we are setting the velocity so we can move around. Besides that, we have a very basic walk animation from the animated sprite 2D, where we are getting down, left, right, and up. Which means I can run the entire thing, and via WASD, I can walk around. That's all that's happening in here. Now to this game, I want to add a couple of characters and speech bubbles. I suppose the first thing that we should be working on is the speech bubble itself, for which I want to close the 9patch rectangle and then create a new scene where the root node is going to be a panel container. This node, by the way, is going to be super important because it scales with the content. Or in other words, if I add a label to it, then I can add any kind of text and the panel container will always scale with it, which is super nice because that way I can add a 9patch rectangle to it and set it to fill the entire space, which it does automatically. For this 9patch rectangle, I want to go to graphics, and there we have bubble.png, which is going to be the texture for this thing. For the patch margins, I want to go with 12, 12, 24, and 20. That way, we get this nice thing at the bottom. Also, if you look at the margins, you can see how this is going to work. On top of that, I want to go to texture and filter it to nearest. That way, we have proper crisp pixel art. Besides that, the label should always be above the speech bubble and be a bit better aligned. You can see this doesn't work perfectly yet. For that, I want to add a margin container and add the label as a child to it. That way, to this margin container, we can add a theme override of 10 to each side except 24 for the last one, so we are adding lots of space at the bottom. Finally, to make all of this a bit more visible, I want to add a theme override to our font. First of all, for the colors, the font color should be black. Besides that, for the fonts, I want to use public pixel, the one we have used earlier, and there we go. Now all of this is much more readable. And even better, if I change the text of the label and add a second line or make this much longer, the speech bubble always expands to cover the size of the text. And this only happens because the label sets the minimum size of the panel container and the 9patch rectangle scales along with it. That means next up, let me get rid of this text. And we now have to update the styling of the panel container, because at the moment we have this darkish background thingy, which we want to get rid of, which we can do very easily by simply giving it a style box empty. That way it disappears entirely, and the only thing left is the speech bubble. Finally, I just have to rename the panel container to speech bubble, and then I want to save the entire thing. Inside of the dialog game, I want to add Speechbubble TSCN. With that, inside of the game, I can simply add the speech bubble somewhere, let's say here for now, run the game. And then we have the speech bubble inside of the 2D game, and it acts like any other Node 2D. So that is pretty straightforward. That being said though, this is only one way to work with UI nodes in a 2D game. Let's say besides that, we wanted to add the HUD scene that we created in the last game. If I simply add it to the scene right now, it's not going to work well. This looks like a mess, and if I run all of it, we are getting the HUD, but well, it is completely broken. Now this happens at the moment because this control node doesn't have a size, which means the custom minimum size is 0 and 0, and everything gets squashed together. On top of that, Godot doesn't move it along with the camera, so this is just weird. Now you could set a custom minimum size of, let's say, 1280 by 720. That way I can zoom out and we would have the original back, except that this is still not working great because it doesn't move with the camera. Also, we want to have flexible UIs. You shouldn't set a custom size here unless you really need it. So this is not what I want to do. Instead, the way you are supposed to approach that is by adding a canvas layer. To this canvas layer, you can then add the HUD, and then all of this is going to work perfectly. Let me run it, and there we go. We have our HUD back, and it moves with the camera and looks pretty good. Effectively, the canvas layer is stuck to the camera and is always covering the entire window. Meaning, if you want to create a HUD for a 2D game, you want to attach it to a canvas layer. Not something I want to do for this game, but this is how you would do it. Now for this game, I want to create a couple of characters that have these speech bubbles. For that, I want to create a new scene where the root node is going to be a static body 2D. Let's rename it right away to character. We can save this one inside of the main folder, doesn't really matter. After that, I want to add a sprite 2D and I want to add a collision shape 2D. For the sprite 2D, I want to go to characters, and there we have a whole bunch of characters we could be using. I'm going to start with green.png. Once again, since we're using pixel art, I want to go to texture and then nearest filtering. Makes all of this look a bit better. On top of that, for the collision shape, I want to set a shape of a rectangle shape 2D and then scale it up. So we are covering roughly the size of the character. Doesn't have to be perfect, this is fine. Now that we have that, I want to add this speech bubble. And there you can see, we can simply drag it along. It acts like any other Node 2D, which means I can save the entire thing and then to the game, add the character we have just created. I can drag him, let's say here, remove the original speech bubble, run the game again, and then we have a character with a speech bubble. We also have collisions, so this is working reasonably well. Although it's not perfect yet, because I want to make sure that this speech bubble is always centered on the horizontal axis to something like this. And this should happen automatically, meaning even if I change the text, it should still update like that. Something we are going to cover in a second. First of all though, I also want to add an area 2D along with a collision shape 2D. For the shape, I want to have a circle shape and drag this one out just a bit. This will be to detect the player, which is on its own collision layer. If you go to collision, the player is on layer 2 and can see layer 1. Which means for the character area 2D, the collision shouldn't have any layer and we can only see layer 2. That way, the only thing that can interact with this area 2D will be the player. Just to test this, let's add a script to the character and then connect the signal of body entered of the area 2D. For now, we can simply print player has entered. Let's try this one now. And we are getting player has entered. Cool. While we are here, for the area 2D, I also want to check if the player has exited this area. That's just another signal. Now we have all that we need to get started. First of all, I want to create an export multi-line var text, which is going to be a string. What this allows me to do inside of the game, if I have a character selected, I can type some text. This text should show up inside of the speech bubble once we are running the game, which means func_ready. I want to get the speech bubble and then run a set text function where we are adding the text that we have just defined. For that though, inside of the speech bubble, we have to add a script to the speech bubble. The defaults here are fine. In fact, we don't need any of this. All we want is a func set text with one parameter, the text, which should be a string. All that this one is going to do is take the label and then update the text to whatever value we are getting from the parameter. That should already do something. If I run the game, the speech bubbles say type some text. That looks perfect. The issue now is that if I add a lot more text in there, let me just type some gibberish and run the entire thing again, then you can see the speech bubble keeps on going forever. Not ideal. To fix that one, inside of the character, you have to make sure that you're always setting this thing to the center point. That way, if I run the scene again, it is always perfectly centered around this character, which is super handy. On top of that, what we can do is get the speech bubble again and then update the position. I simply want to add a vector 2 to it. X is going to be 0. We don't want to move left or right. Instead, I want to go up by 50 pixels. Let's try all of this, and now the speech bubble is slightly on top of the character. Now, before we continue, back inside of the game, I want to make sure that we only have a bit of text so this doesn't look too silly. Let's try it again, and that looks about alright. You could move the entire speech bubble a bit further to the left so it aligns better with this little bit at the end, but that you can do on your own. In my case, I simply want to animate the entire thing, which we can do by getting the speech bubble once again, and then changing the scale to vector 2.0. With that, by default, we cannot see the speech bubble because it doesn't have any size. To fix that, when the player is entering or exiting, I want to animate it via a tween, which means var tween is going to be create tween, and then tween.tween_property, in which we are getting the speech bubble. We want to animate the scale property. The target value is going to be vector 2.1 over a duration of 0.4 seconds. We can make sure that we always go from a value of vector 2.0. Let's try all of this now. And if I walk into the area, it does work, but it's not working perfectly yet. That is because the pivot point is in the top left. I think another way of seeing that is if we copy all of this stuff and paste it in there, where we are doing the opposite. Our target value is going to be vector.0, and we go from vector.1. With that system, I can go in, we get a speech bubble, I can go out, the speech bubble disappears. So that is working, we just have to fix the pivot point. To get that one, once the scene is ready, I want to grab the speech bubble once again, and then set the pivot offset, which always needs to be a vector 2, where we have an x and a y value. In my case, I want to pivot offset to be in the center on the x-axis and at the bottom on the y-axis. And for all of that, we can get the speech bubble and then use get_rectangle. That way, we're getting a rectangle which has a size, and on the size we can get x and y, which I want to divide by 2 to get right in the middle. Besides that, I can copy the entire getRect line and then change x to y. That way, we are at the bottom of the speech bubble. Let's try all of this now. And if I go in there, this still doesn't work. And the reason is a bit annoying. Basically, at the moment, we are setting the text of the speech bubble, we're giving it a position, we are scaling it to a size of 0, and then we are updating the pivot offset. But that doesn't work well yet, because the scale of the entire thing is 0 and 0. This we only want to do after we have updated the pivot offset. With that, I can run the entire thing again, and now we are scaling from the center, which is looking much better. So you do have to be careful here when you are scaling the thing and when you're getting the pivot offset, especially if you're using getRectangle. Other than that though, we are very nearly done. One more thing that I do want to do is create another export variable, except this one is going to be an enum, where we are getting a whole bunch of options. Let me copy them in. I want to get blonde, green, purple, and hat, which we are then storing inside of a variable called model, which needs to be a string with a default value of blonde. And also, I have to make sure that this is spelled correctly. Export enum, that looks much better. So what this is going to do is, inside of the character folder, we have a couple of graphics, blonde, green, hat, and purple. Those should be selectable from inside of the game, or in other words, inside of the character. Depending on what is selected in here, I should be getting different kinds of characters, which we can implement very easily. All I want to do inside of the character, I want to update the sprite 2D, and then more specifically the texture. For that, I want to load a file path. Let's say for now, I always want to get the blonde character. If I run the game, we are always getting the blonde lady along with the same speech bubble. This we want to customize using the value that we are getting from export enum. And I realized there's another typo in there. This should be model. Now in our case, all that we have to do is turn this into 2 strings, where we first of all have the file path to the characters folder, and then we have .png. Once we have that, we can add the model value in there, and then we are good to go. If I now run the entire thing, right now we have blonde selected, which is our default value, so we get the blonde lady. That is working. But if I'm changing this to purple, run the game again, we are getting the purple graphic. Cool. That means now we can duplicate the character, move it to the side, change the text to something else, doesn't really matter, and then give it another character graphic, and we should get 2 characters with speech bubbles. We have the blonde character, and we have the character with the hat. And that is looking pretty good. So with that, you can create speech bubbles and work with layout nodes inside of a 2D game. Righty, we are nearly done with this tutorial. There's just a Zelda style menu left to do. At this point, all of this should be somewhat doable, although I think it's still a bit of a challenge. But what I want you guys to try is to recreate all of this yourself and see how far you get. Now, I imagine that you are going to struggle quite a bit, but just try to get started and see how far you get by just trying things on your own. But don't worry, I'm going to go through all of this in just a second. Once again, here we are back in Godot, and I want to work in folder 7, Inventory. In there, we have a folder for graphics, and we have Godot viewport. If you open that one, and you go to the 3D view, you can see we have Godot, so the character model, a camera 3D, a directional light 3D, and a world environment. That way, all of this looks reasonably well. I guess also, really important, the root node is a sub-viewport. That way, we can add all of this to a 2D scene very easily. Speaking of which, I want to create a user interface scene that I have renamed to inventory. Let's save it inside of 7 inventory and save inventory.tscn. That is giving us a scene, and next up, I want to work with a couple of things in there. So in there, we have Godot, icons, objects, thumbnails, and UI. Inside of UI, we have a background that we're going to add later and selection corners. First of all, we have to work with the very basic layout, which is going to be an HBox container that covers the entire window. This will then consist of 2 parts. Number 1, I want to add a sub-viewport container, which will then get the Godot viewport as a child. That way, we're getting Godot, and we're getting a 3D thing right away. I'll talk about this thing in more detail later on. For now, this is all we need to get started. I guess one thing that I do want to do is enable stretch, and then set it to expand, so we are covering the entire window. This would be, let's rename it, the Godot character. Besides that, I want to create the actual menu, for which I first of all am going to add a simple control node that should come before the 3D scene, so it's on the left side. This node should also expand, and on top of that, for the layout and the container sizing, I want to set the stretch ratio to 2. That way, Godot takes up 1/3 of the screen and the menu 2/3, which seems like a good separation. To this control node, I want to add a VBox container, which is going to fill the entire available space. And to that node, I want to add 3 things. First of all, an HBox container, then a H separator, this one, so we have a dividing line. And finally, I want to have a tab container. In terms of sizing, the tab container should take up most of the space, meaning this one should expand. The H separator is just going to be a line, so this one doesn't really have to do anything. And for the HBox container, I want to set a custom minimum size of 60 pixels. I guess while we're here, to this HBox container, I want to add a texture rectangle. And for that, inside of icons, you can find the 3 icons that I want to add. First of all, should be the sword. I want to fit width, and for the stretch mode, keep aspect centered. That way, we're getting 1 sword. This I then want to duplicate 2 more times, because next up, I want to have the shield and the item for texture 3. So with that, we have the 3 items, and they should be centered, which means for the alignment for the HBox container, this should be center. Although that being said, I think beginning also doesn't look too bad. It's kind of up to you. Just choose whatever you like. Besides that, inside of theme overrides, constants, I want to add a custom separation of 20 pixels. That way, we have just a bit more space between the elements. That doesn't look too bad. Next up, for the H separator, I also want to add a custom minimum size on the y-axis of 20 pixels, so we have just a bit more space between the elements. Speaking of space, I want to have a bit of space to the top, to the left, and at the bottom. For that, when we are setting the VBox container, I want to change the anchor preset to custom, and then give it a few offsets. For the left side, I want to have 50 pixels. For the top, I want 50 pixels. The right can stay at 0, and bottom should also be 50 pixels. Actually, this should be negative 50 pixels. With that, we have a bit of padding around the thing, which I think looks a lot better. And that is already a reasonable start. If I now run the scene, we have something. Not perfect yet, but definitely a start. To this tab container, I want to add a grid container node. If I do that, we're getting this top tab, which I don't really care about. To get rid of it, inside of the tab container, you can set tabs visible to false. And that way, it's not going to be visible anymore. Besides that, I want to duplicate the grid container 2 times, so we have 3 grid containers that we can work with. Also, while we're here, for the grid containers, the columns should be 4 every single time. This should apply to all 3 of them, like so. After we have that, we can work on the styling a bit more. For that, to inventory, I want to add a new theme. We have the tab container and we have the grid container. And I guess just to have everything in one place, for the HBox container, we are currently using a theme override of 20 pixels, which I want to remove and place it inside of the theme, which means in there, we will also need an HBox container where we are setting the separation to 20 pixels. Besides that, for the tab container, we have to get rid of the background, which is the panel. We can either go with a style box empty or a style box flat, and if you click on that one, you can disable draw center. That way it disappears. Finally then, for the grid container, I want to set H and V separation to 20 pixels, so we would have more space between them. That way we're getting much better styling, and that covers most of it. There's just one more minor thing that I want to work on, and that is for Godot. When we have Godot viewport, I want to have a transparent background. So go to the sub-viewport node, and in there, transparent background. This we can enable quite easily because inside of the viewport, we're already accounting for canvas lighting, which means this part is fairly straightforward, and that way we have a fairly decent setup. Now to populate it, we have to add another node, which is going to be a button. That way it can be focused and pressed. Although this I want to rename to item. Then I want to save it inside of inventory. That's totally fine. Now to that thing, we're going to add quite a few things. But first of all, I want to make sure we are covering the entire rectangle, like so. That is much nicer. And I want to add a texture rectangle to it. And I guess something that we haven't done yet is use an aspect ratio container. This we could do fairly easily. It should cover the entire available space. And to that, I want to add a texture rectangle. Just so that we have something, I want to go to thumbnails and then select any of these items. Doesn't really matter which one. Let's go with dagger.png. And this is perfectly centered and will always have an aspect ratio of 1. Now, alternatively, you could have also gone simply with scale mode and keep aspect centered, along with fit width or fit height. Would both work. Now that we have this item, we can go to the first grid container, the one that's visible, and add the item scene to it, which is not going to work well at all. If I multiply this a couple of times, you can see that this is looking very strange, but we do get 4 columns. So something is working. Now, the issue we have at the moment is that the item button thing doesn't know how large it needs to be. It defaults to the minimum possible size, and as a consequence, we can only really see the graphic, which doesn't scale down, because for the texture, we are keeping the size. And to fix that, you'll want to go to Item, and in there, enable Expand. If you're doing that for all of them, let me get rid of these 2 and instead duplicate the first button. We can do this multiple times, and this is coming together much more nicely. If I now run the scene, we're getting something vaguely respectable, although still not great. And I want all of these buttons to be perfect squares, which means we have to add a few more things to it. Also, all of these items should be added dynamically, which means we couldn't simply press a button to expand it. This should happen in code. For all of that, I want to add a script to inventory. The default naming here is fine, although for the template, I want this to be empty. Click on create, and now we have a script that we can work with. For this one, first of all, we will need our data, which I want to store in a constant dictionary. And this is going to be quite a bit more data, so let me copy it in. The entire thing should look like this. We have a dictionary where we have a couple of sub-dictionaries. The first one is called weapons, and inside of this dictionary, we have an index, and then the available weapons. Same with shields. We first have an index and then the different options. Besides that, on ready, I want to have the item scene available, which we can simply preload. I want to get item.tscn. That looks pretty good. If I minimize data, we can see quite a bit better what's going on. This data we want to use to create a whole bunch of items, which means we want to work with underscore ready. And there, I want to create items, which is a separate function. Create underscore items, no need for parameters. Effectively in there, let's have a look at the dictionary. We first of all have a whole bunch of categories that we want to cycle through. In other words, for category in data. After that, inside of each category, we have the item. Although we do want to ignore index, we only want to look at dagger, sword, crossbow, and so on. As a consequence, I want for item in data category. If that is the case, on this for loop, we want to do two things. First of all, we want to get the actual item, which means if item is different from index, and this index should be a string. That way, we are always ignoring this first item. This is just there to identify which kind of grid container we are working with. 0 is going to be for weapons, 1 is going to be for the shields, and 2 is going to be for the items. Or style, whatever you want to call it. Which means, for now, item being different from index is going to get a pass, and before that, I want to identify the target container, which we can get by simply dragging in the tab container, and from this, we want to get one child, which we are getting from data category. Let's copy it. And then we want to get the current index. That way we know which container we want to be in. After that, we're getting all of the items, and I want to create, let's call it an item slot, which is going to be an item scene dot instantiate. On this item slot, I want to set the size flags already, which means we want to get size underscore flags underscore horizontal. To get the value here, we want to set this to control.sizeExpand. And then for some reason, you need this pipe operator and then get control.sizeAndFill. That way, we are expanding to get the entire available space and filling that space as well. Finally, I want to get the target container and add a child to it, which is going to be the item slot we have just created. With that, let's try all of this, and we should be getting a couple of elements. This is kind of working. Now, we do know for the first category, we have 5 items, from dagger to staff. And inside of the game, we are getting 5 slots as well, so this is kind of working. The issue we have at the moment is that we do have horizontal space, but we don't have vertical one. That we have to work on. And for that, inside of the item slots, I want to call a function. I guess we can do that before we are changing the size. I want to call item slot and then a setup function, where we are first of all adding the item, so what this kind of button needs to be. The button also needs to know what kind of category it has. And on top of that, I want to get data, category, and then another round of indexing with the item. That way, we are getting the index, and that is going to be important later on. This gives us lots of information. Next up, inside of the item, we at the moment don't have a script. That has to change. I want to add a script to it. All the default here is fine, except the script should be empty. The one function that we absolutely need is func setup, the one that we have just created inside of inventory, or rather the one that we have just called. On top of that, I think we can close a whole bunch of stuff. We don't need control, UI code, theme, speech bubble, readme, dialog game, player can go, mesh instance go, main.gd can go, keyboard control can go, HUD can go, comment notes can go, and character.gd can also go. That way, we only have inventory and item, which feels a lot cleaner. For the item, we have to cover these 3 arguments, which means I want to have a couple of parameters. The first one is going to be, let's for now call it simply text, and this has to be a string. After that, we have the category. This one should rather be the type, I guess. This also has to be a string. And finally, I want to get index. This one needs to be an integer. Now, to store all of this data, I want to create a couple of variables when the scene is created. I want to have the equipment type, which has to be a string, and let's give it a default value of weapon. Besides that, var equipment index needs to be an integer with a default value of 0, which is what we're getting by default. Once we have that, inside of setup, I want to get the equipment index, which has to be the index from the parameters. And besides that, equipment type should be the type that we're getting from the parameter. And just to test if this is working, for now, I want to hide the aspect ratio container and instead add a label. The text of this label is going to get the value that we're getting from the parameters. That should be a good test to check if this is working, and I have run the wrong scene. Should be running inventory. Try this one, and there we're getting dagger, sword, crossbow, axe, and staff. That looks good, but once again, we are missing vertical space, and that we really have to work on. The best way to approach that is inside of the item. Every time we are resizing a node, we want to run some code so that we are always setting the button to be as high as it's wide. And for that, inside of the signals, somewhere we have resized. This signal we want to work with, which means I want to connect it to the item scene, and in there, I want to set the custom minimum size dot y to get underscore rectangle dot size dot x. That way, every time we are resizing the window, we would get a different size for all of the containers. And importantly, the size would only be the horizontal size, which means we are still lacking vertical space. However, because of this line, whenever we are updating the horizontal space, we are also updating the vertical space, which means now, if I am running the inventory scene, we are getting a much better result. So this is looking drastically better. On top of that, what we can also do now is make the aspect ratio container with the texture rectangle visible again and hide the label. That way, inside of the inventory scene, we are getting a much better result. Although we are still getting the same texture, but that we can change right now actually. When we are running the setup scene, I want to get the texture rectangle and then update the texture. All I want to do in here is to load one of the images from thumbnails. This is very similar compared to what we have done inside of the speech bubble bit for the characters. Although I'm running a bit out of space, but for now, let me simply add the dagger in there, so we have something to work with. At the moment, we're going to inventory, graphics, thumbnails, and there we are getting one image. This should be dynamic, which means I want to get rid of the dagger, then add more quotation marks. After that, we can insert something else, and the else is going to be the text that we are getting from the parameters. Now at this point, it's really important to mention that the name of the PNG file has to correspond with the name inside of the data dictionary. In other words, this one dagger here has to correspond to dagger.png. Once you have that, you can run the scene again, and we're getting different kinds of weapons. Pretty nice. And I want to minimize these windows just a bit so I have more space to work with. It's much better. I suppose next up, we can add some code so we can switch between the swords, the shields, and the items. For that, once again, I want to work inside of inventory. First of all, in there, I want to highlight the current active tab container, which in practice means when we are starting with the sword, I want to reduce the opacity of the shield and of the items. Once the shield is selected, the other two should be a bit more opaque. I want to go for child in the hbox container up here, and then get underscore children. Don't forget to call this one, very important. And after that, child.modulate.alpha should be 0.1. With that, all three of the texture rectangles should be less visible, and that looks pretty good. Besides that, before we are running any kind of code, I want to create a variable called selection_index with a default value of 0, and this has to be an integer, so we can simply do integer. After we have reduced the opacity for all of the children, I want to pick the one child from the current selection index and make it fully visible. Which means, once again, I want to get the hbox container and only get a single child via this selection index. On this node, I want to get modulate alpha again and set it to 1. That way, I can run the entire scene again, and the sword is fully visible, but the other two icons are a bit more grayed out. Perfect. To switch between the two, I want to check for input. First of all, I want to get the menu direction, which we have done before. I want to get input and then get axes, for which we need a negative and a positive direction. And for that, I have menu left for negative and menu right for positive. All of this should also be an integer at all times, so we are going to wrap it in the int function. Just to make sure this is working, let's print menu direction. If I run the scene, I can press A and D, and we're getting -1 or 0. The 0 we are going to ignore later on anyway. Other than that though, this is working. Which means next up, I want to check if menu direction has an actual value. Or in other words, it's different from 0, but that we're getting by default, so this is fine. First of all, I want to update the selection index. For that, I want to use pos mod and then get the current selection index plus the menu direction. For the y value, I simply want to get all of the items inside of the hbox container, which means I want to get this one and then get child count. And now that we have that, we can let me print the selection index and run the entire thing. If I now press to the right and keep on pressing, we are always toggling between 0, 1, and 2. The same would work in the other direction, so this is working quite nicely. At the end of all of this, we are always getting some kind of index. And this index we can use to toggle between the different tabs of the tab container. In other words, I want to get the tab container indented properly and then set the current tab to the selection index. We don't need to print anything anymore. And instead, if I now run the entire thing, I can toggle between the different options. That is working, although inside of the top icons, we cannot see this change, which is a bit confusing. To fix that part, all we have to do is kind of what we have done up here. In fact, let me copy the two lines. I first of all want to reduce the opacity for all of them to 0.1. And after that, I want to get the currently selected one and then remove all transparency. That way, we are selecting the right icon. That works quite well, and I can go in any direction forever. We are always toggling to the next category. Now, one thing that I did notice happen sometimes is that when you're pressing a button once, the thing jumps a couple of steps ahead. Kind of hard to see right now, but it might be an issue on your side. If that is a problem for you, what you can do is wait get underscore 3 and then create a timer with a value of, let's say, 0.4. And on this thing, you are awaiting the timeout signal. That way, after every input event, you have a bit of a pause. That way, it becomes basically impossible to accidentally hit a button twice. Can be a nice safeguard, not mandatory, but I think it helps sometimes. That covers the main input. Next up, what we really have to make sure is when we are running the scene, we have to focus the first button, because only then can we select other buttons inside of this grid container. I want to create a function called focus item. Doesn't need any parameters. All we want to do in here is get the currently selected tab container. Simply drag it in there. We want to get the grid container that is currently selected, which we can get via this selection index. On this selection index, we want to get the first child, which means get child and 0, which is giving us the item slot. This one we want to focus via grab focus. Once we have that, we have to make sure that we are calling focus item once the scene is ready. Let's try that. And now the dagger is already selected, even without me pressing anything. Means we can move around and do other things. If I press space, we are selecting one of those, but that doesn't do anything at the moment, which is fine. Which is totally fine, that we can work on in just a bit. First of all though, after we are changing the container, we also want to call focus item. That way, we always get the first child being focused, even if we go to a different container. So I can press D, and we don't have the shield selected. Something didn't work. In fact, we have nothing selected, so if I press the arrow keys, nothing is going to happen. While testing all of this, the issue seems to be that if we are trying to run this right away, Godot gets a bit confused. To fix that, we simply want to have a very short pause before we are running this line. This can be 0.1 seconds. And now, if we're trying this again, the dagger is selected. If I go to shields, we have the shield selected. And this also works on other buttons. This is looking much better. Now, unfortunately, I have no idea why you need this pause before you're grabbing the focus. If you figure out the reason for it, let me know in the comments. But other than that, we can minimize focus item and input, and then work on the next bit. We also finished with the underscore ready function. We actually have to mostly focus on item.gd. For this one, first of all, I want to add one more node, which is going to be a panel. For this panel, I want to cover the entire available space, and in the inspector under layout, I want to give it custom values. The anchor points can stay as they are. 0, 0, 1, 1 is totally fine, but I want to add a few offsets of 2 and 2 for left and top, and -2 and -2 for the bottom and the right. Row direction is going to be both that we are getting from the preset. Once we have that, we are getting, you can very barely see it. We now have a panel that's this darker area that is slightly inset from the button. That is our root node. After that, inside of theme override styles, I want to give it a style box flat. We don't want to draw the center. Instead, we only want to have a very thin border, which means we want to have border and border width. The border width is going to be 2 pixels on every side, while the color is CC, 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 and 2F to get very low opacity. Finally, I want to have 1 pixel of a corner radius to make all of this just a bit nicer. Now, if we are zooming out, we are getting a very thin border around the entire thing. It's quite hard to see, but if we are running the game, they can see we have a thin border around all of the buttons, which I think looks nice, but it's quite subjective. After that, I want to add another texture rectangle. which I want to rename to selection rect. For this selection rectangle, I want to go to UI, and in there we have selection corners, which is going to be the texture for this texture rectangle. And for that, we want to cover the entire available space. Although for the sizing, I want to keep the size, and for scaling the stretch mode, it should be keep aspect centered. Effectively, every time an icon is focused, I want to make this selection rectangle visible. If the button is not focused, it should disappear. For that, we need just a bit of code, for which we first of all have to check if focus has entered and has left, which we can do via the signals in there somewhere. For the button, we have focus entered and focus exited. Both of those I want to connect to the script. If the focus is entering, then I want to get this selection rectangle and show it. If the focus is exiting, then I want to do the exact opposite. I want to hide the selection rectangle. That should already do something. If I now run all of this, we are showing all of the selection rectangles, at least until I get to focus them. That is because, by default, this selection rectangle should not be visible. You could either hide it in there, or alternatively, inside of a ready function, you could simply hide it. Let me copy this line down here, paste it in there. And now, if I run inventory again, we are only getting the corners on the currently focused item. And this works on other categories as well. That is quite nice. That being said though, I want to work on the layout for this selection rectangle just a bit more. Specifically, I don't want to use a full rectangle. This should be custom. That way we are getting the offsets. And for left and top, I want -1. For right and bottom, I want to have 1 pixel. What this is going to do is move these corners a bit to the outside, which is giving us just a bit of space around them. Cool. With that, we have the corners. Next up, I want to work on the button styling itself. For that, we can go to theme overrides, or you could create a custom theme. I want to work with normal. Let's add a style box flat to that. For the BG color, I want to have a value of 04, 04, 04, and 7A. A very dark color with low transparency. Let's see how that is looking in the game. That is working fairly well. On top of that, I want to set a corner radius of 1 pixel for every corner. And that's pretty much all that we need in here. Besides that, I want to make sure when this button is focused, we are also changing the style. The color I used for this one is 485A997B, a transparent bluish color. I guess while we're here, corner radius can also be 1 pixel on every side. Let's try this one. And this is coming together much more nicely. Now we can actually see what's going on, and we only have the corners. We don't have these weird edges anymore. This also works on different categories. Once again, cool. We are making a ton of progress. There's one more thing that I do want to add to the items, and that is a simple panel, which I have renamed to equipped panel. This one should cover the entire available space, and it should be below the texture rectangle. In fact, the texture rectangle should be on top of everything else. I think that looks best. For this equip panel, I want to have a custom style box flat. The color I went with is going to be 54E6FF A9. A transparent light blue. On top of that, I want to have a corner radius of 1 pixel for every corner. And then we get something. If I now run inventory, we are getting a light blue color. This should only be there if the current item is equipped. For that, we need just a bit of code, and let me maximize this. We first of all want to check if the button was pressed, and that we can get via a signal. So inside of the item, I want to check if this button was pressed. connected. Then we can work inside of a function. Basically, I want for item in get the parent of the current node and then get all of the children of that node. That way, I'm going to get all of the items in the current container. And all of those I want to unequip, which is going to be another function, unequip. Which means next up, we have to create the function unequip. All that this one is going to do, it takes the equipment panel and hides it. That way, no item looks like it was equipped, but we do want to equip the one that was last pressed, which means for this one, we want to show it. And finally, like we have done for the selection rectangle, when the scene is ready, we want to hide all of the equip panels. With that, if I run this thing again, we don't get any of the equipped color, but if I select a sort, we are getting the equipment status. This also works over multiple categories, so that is quite nice. That also means we are nearly done with the menu itself. There's one thing that is very obviously missing, and that is a background. For that, I simply have a forest.bg JPEG file that I want to add via a texture rectangle, which really importantly has to come before the HBox container. This is going to be our background. It should cover the entire window, like so. And for the texture, I want to have forest.bg.jpg. Drag it in there. And now we have a background for which I want to fit the current width, and that looks all right. If I now run all of this again, this is looking significantly better. Everything else also works just fine, so we are making quite a bit of progress. The last thing that we have to work on is to make sure that when we are doing something in the menu, Godot is also updating. Inside of Godot viewport, and this has to be a 3D scene, we first of all want to get Godot. And that is easy because Godot is inside of a group called Godot. To make sure this is working inside of inventory, I want to make it so that we can rotate the model, which is going to be another function, and I want to check the process function for that. In this function, I want to create a variable for pan, and I want to get the direction, which I'm getting from input, and once again, get the axis. The negative direction is going to be pan left. The positive one is going to be pan right. These buttons, once again, you can find inside of the input map. Somewhere in there, we have pan right and pan left. At the moment, they are only mapped to a controller. If you don't have a controller, add some extra bindings in here and you should be good to go. Now to use that value, we have to get the Godot character, which we can get via onReady var Godot, and then get _tree, and get first node in group Godot. This is going to be a node 3D. If you look at Godot viewport, we are getting this Godot. And if you add as node 3D, you are getting all of the predictions for the code, which makes your life a bit easier. I want to check if we have a pan direction, and if that is the case, I want to get the Godot model and then rotate Y. The amount is going to be the pan direction multiplied with delta, and then I want to add a pan rotation speed, which doesn't exist yet, but we can create it via another variable. I want this value to be 3. That should be it. If I now run not the viewport, but the inventory, if I use my controller and the right joystick, I can go left and right, and we are rotating the model. That looks really, really good. Also on the controller, you can use the shoulder button to go left and right. And if you use the left joystick, you can select different options. You can also press them. All of this works just with the controller perfectly fine. That covers another important part. I do want to add a bit of white space, and then we have everything we need inside of the inventory. Next up, for the item. Whenever we are pressing the item with the current equipment type and index, we actually want to show that. And how that is going to work, if you look at the Godot model, you can expand it, and in there, let me expand this side as well. We have all of the parts of the model, so the arm, the body, the head, and so on. But on top of that, we have a right-hand slot, a left-hand slot, and a head slot. Those have a whole bunch of children. For example, there we have dagger 2, and if you make this one visible, you can see the dagger. We also have a sword, we have a crossbow, and so on. What is also really important is that the order of these children is the same order that we have used inside of the inventory data. The first child is the dagger, and this we're getting here. The second child, or the one with the index 1, is going to be this one. Then we have the crossbow. That way we can connect the index to the child, which isn't the greatest system, because if you have lots more weapons, you would have to add all of them as a child, which eventually gets a bit annoying. So this part you might want to refine, but for simple tutorial, I think this part still works. Inside of the item, we're getting the equipment index. This we want to use to target Godot, and for that, first of all, we have to get the Godot model, which we have already done inside of inventory. Let me copy this one. We want to get Godot inside of the items as well. And as always, I'm running a bit out of space, but this is working. Now we have Godot, and on this Godot model, we want to run a function. Whenever the button is pressed, so on pressed, I want to get Godot and then equip, for which we need the current equipment type along with the equipment index. For that to work, we have to go to Godot viewport and then get the Godot model and add a script to it. We don't need any of the default functions. Instead, I want to create a func equip, which has a type and an index. I guess just to be a bit more clear here, the type should be a string and the index should be an integer. For now, let me add pass in here, because before we are writing the code for this one, I want to make things a bit more accessible. We want to target the right-hand slot, the left-hand slot, and the head slot. So ideally, those should just be variables that we can target right away. I want on ready var, let's call it right hand, is going to be the right-hand slot. Besides that, on ready var left hand is going to be the left-hand slot node. And finally, on ready var head, we want to have the head slot. This part isn't strictly necessary. I think it just makes things more readable. Now, once we have that, I want to check if the type is equal to weapons. Then we want to hide all of the children of the right-hand slot. Or in other words, for child in right hand and get children, I want to run child.hide. After that, I want to get the right hand, call get child along with the index. This one node I then want to show. And that should be all we need. If I now run the scene again and I select the dagger, we're getting the dagger. If I select the sword, we're getting the sword. Same with crossbow, same with axe, and same with the wand. We can also still rotate. This works very well. That means next up, we can duplicate all of this stuff, paste it in here, and then check for shields, or whatever value we have inside of the data dictionary. I'm looking for shields. If that is the case, I want to hide all of the children inside of the left hand, and then get left hand, index, and show. That way we have the shields. Finally, duplicate all of this one more time, because next up we are looking for, I believe I called this one style, where we have the glasses and the hats. For this one, I want to look at all of the children of the hat and then only show the one with the current index. Which means now we should basically be done. I can still select the sword, I can select the shield, and finally I can select the duck for a head. We can also still rotate, that part works, and if I select another item, we are getting another item. Same with the shields. Cool, this one works, and the crossbow also works. Very good. So with that, we have basically a Zelda style menu. Now, this still is very basic, but if you've gotten so far, you can probably expand this thing a lot. But that you can do in your own time. So I hope all of this was helpful, and I see you around.